Goedemorgen, Maarten. Well, I'll try to start. We now start with the presentation of Bart de Biezer and Annelies Verkest, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves to you. I would like to say a word of sorrow for you because it's the last day. And of course, what happens the last day is the international guests feel so seduced to go to one of our beautiful museums. So not everybody is around anymore. And I pity this for you. But I was expecting this beforehand. So I invited special guests for you. Also from the nursing world, but also from the world of the bereaved. And also an old friend who is influential still in healthcare, if he wants to. So I think you will be content with getting to know these people, and I'm sure that everybody will enjoy your speeches, also of the one who will follow you. So we have first the floor to the Belgian researchers. Okay.
To comfort me, Bart always says to me, Annelies, don't you worry, English is for Belgians only our fourth language, so we'll try to do it. Okay, we'll speak today about family expectations in supporting inpatients with suicidal ideations, and we'll give some perspectives about that. But first, we'll introduce ourselves. Bart is my colleague, lecturer and colleague researcher at the VUVES University of Applied Sciences. That's in West Flanders, the west part of Belgium, in the Dutch-speaking part of it. And we met each other years ago in the clinic St. Joseph, where he still works as researcher, and where I worked at that time as a clinical nurse specialist. But today we will present to you the results of the research project of Yuri van de Walle. Yuri is the one in below. He's a researcher on mental health nursing, on the identity and the roles of mental health nurses, specifically in supporting patients with suicidal ideations. But where is Yuri? Why isn't he here, you could ask. He is no lazy bone who is sleeping now at the moment. He is just expecting his first baby tomorrow. So that's why he asked us to represent him here. Okay, the general outline of what we are going to tell to you. We will speak about the two articles in the right about family expectations of inpatient mental health services for adults with suicidal ideations. That was a qualitative study Yuri did. And on the other hand, we will speak about the nurse's perspective on promoting and preserving safety and a life-oriented perspective, also a qualitative study. We will start with some background. Afterwards, we will discuss the findings from the family perspective and the nurse's perspective, and we will end with some discussion points. And the key points, some integrated things we will tell you about family and nurse's perspective. All right. First, some background. I will start with that. Afterwards, it will be Bart who will explain the findings of the two studies. First, I have to tell theories on the suicidal process emphasize the interpersonal nature of suicide. Those theories stress that a person's interactions with his or her family members can represent both risk factors and protective factors for suicide. For example, social isolation or conflicts in some families can increase the suicidal risk. But on the other hand, family connectedness, feeling supported, can decrease that suicidal risk and even be reasons for living. Due to those potential benefits of the connections with the family members, the newest policies and guidelines emphasize all the importance of family involvement in mental health services. Literature underlines, though, that it is very complex to involve the family of a patient with suicidal thoughts in the care and the treatment process. First of all, both family members and patients experience a big stigma attached to being suicidal. Sometimes they are even ashamed about having a suicidal relative, and they find it difficult to share their thoughts and feelings about it or to ask for help. But also patients feel stigma and suffer the feeling of loneliness and being misunderstood. This might withhold them from talking about it with their family or with the mental health practitioners. Literature also underlines the burdens family members face when caring for a suicidal relative. It might be traumatic for family members to face a suicidal crisis, even another suicidal crisis of someone they love. And it can evoke personal feelings of guilt, extreme anxiety, and feeling helpless. Moreover, a suicidal crisis can even adversely affect family relationships. This is even a bigger barrier for family involvement in mental health services. For example, when I, as a mental health practitioner, invite family members to come to the ward and to speak about the treatment or how to help the patient, they could refuse to come because they need some time themselves to recover, or they are very tired of taking care all the time. Concluding, we could underpin that both family members and nurses can play a vital role in the recovery process when patients stay in a mental health service with suicidal thoughts. They can be emotionally available, they can share activities and experiences together, and stay connected with the patient in everyday life. But unfortunately, there is a huge gap between that theory, that procedure, the policies, and the daily practice. Although all those guidelines emphasize the importance of family involvement, it is clear that it is still poorly enacted. Furthermore, we could also say already that studies worldwide highlight that nurses' interactions with patients often lack therapeutic engagement. Nurses are increasingly involved in the protocol-based practices for suicide prevention, and these practices are often defensive and do not value or even obstruct nurses' efforts to provide the relational care, the emotional care for patients experiencing suicidal ideation. This all puts the fundamentals of nursing under a big pressure. But now Bart will explain the findings of the research of UDI.
Okay, thank you, Annelies, for this nice introduction. And I will go on with presenting for you the first study that we will discuss with you, the study related to family experiences who care for patients with suicidal ideation. So we captured their experiences of a group of family members, parents, children, sisters, brothers, and so on. And I will tell you more. And it was a grounded theory study, qualitative study, what means that we are looking for the underlying processes behind what patients tell us. And you see also the core element, what was captured in our study, namely that family members struggle to remain hopeful while looking through the lens of uncertainty. So on the one hand, they experience hope, and on the other hand, they experience uncertainty, or they expect, in fact, to become hopeful, more hopeful, to live without suicidal ideation. And on the other hand, they also are confronted with uncertainty, what I want to tell you more about in the further slides. And what was also interesting was that, so you can see hope and uncertainty as two dimensions on one dimension. And it depends whether their expectations were met or unmet, if they were hopeful or uncertain. So when family members perceived their expectations as met, it increased their hope and decreased their uncertainty. Conversely, when they perceived that their expectations were unmet, it thwarted their hope and it increased their uncertainty. And it's well illustrated in the quotes below. I will read it for you. Almost too late, but I found him just in time. Now we live in continuous uncertainty. So the two concepts are in this. And but it was also important to say that in the study we find more uncertainty than hope. So although experience of hope were documented in the interviews, so we did semi-structured interviews with the family members, unmet expectations were far more common. The interviewed family members in this research shared overall experiences which were underpinned by a sense of being marginalized, being sidelined, felt left alone, not at the center of mental health practitioners' attention, and having limited control and left unknown about what happened in the mental health service. That was also very important to mention. The core element was related with 4 sub-elements, as you can read, and I will only discuss the first due to time constraints, the first sub-element assuming safety as a priority, but the other elements are also important to mention. So family members were also looking for a healing environment for their relatives, and they also want continuity of care. And they want to be involved and supported. And it was so important to mention that their expectations were contextualized within their own caregiving experiences. So, for example, for looking for a healing environment, what they did when the person was still at home, for example, was using humor, just to give them more comfort, or buying a dog. Because maybe that can distract him and help him and so on, or listening carefully, or giving hugs from time to time. So that was their way to give some relief to the distressing experiences where their relatives were confronted with. And when looking for a healing environment, for example, they also want supportive carers, of caregivers. They want a personal approach. They want also sometimes respite care for themselves, because it was sometimes very difficult for them to always be there for their relatives, and so on. But now maybe I will go on further on the safety. So safety, that was also a primary expectation of family members. Most family members highlighted their experiences of being confronted with their relatives' suicide attempts. So they were confronted time to time with suicidal attempts, and these experiences evoked intense feelings of anxiety, and what makes them constant vigilance and controlling to prevent suicide. And while family members living together, they could no longer leave their relatives at home. Others ensured their accessibility or regularly contacted their relatives to check their moods. And this uncertainty could become intolerable as they felt highly responsible and helpless in a no longer safe environment. So what they expect from the caregivers in the mental health institution, because all the participants were admitted in a hospital, and the family members expected that there also was a safe environment, where the relative suicide risk was minimized, and so then their uncertainty could become more tolerable for themselves. And so it's well documented here in this quote of this participant. who mentioned, my mother has suicidal tendencies, and yet she was sent home. That must not be allowed. They must keep her inside and exercise more control over her. So family members want a secure environment, even, and it was striking for us because we are now in a time where recovery care is very common, and all institutions are preparing their personnel or staff to become more recovery focused, and that means that you need to more liberate ideas about safety and so on, and dialogue and conversations together and so on. But in our survey, we saw that for family members, suicidality was a good reason to enact, for example, even restraints. Most family members also were skeptical towards more freedom. For example, if their relatives were could go somewhere unsupervised to the shop or whatever, they didn't understand it. They want also support room checks, and a roommate could help to do some social control, and or perform back control and so on. Because they think if there are no medication or little means in the hospital, that they couldn't do something to themselves, and so they want that guarantee, and therefore they expect it also from mental health practitioners. And so we see a sort of, first I will go to the second study, excuse me, the nurse interaction study. That in this study we aim to explore or to understand the actions and aims of nurses in psychiatric hospitals during their interactions with patients experiencing suicidal ideation. So it was also a qualitative study, also a grounded theory study, also looking for underlying processes and so on. And the main core element that was unraveled was promoting and preserving safety and a life-oriented perspective. So that reflects nurses' aims in their interactions with patients experiencing suicidal ideation. And the analysis of the interviews shows that the nurses' interactions were guided more by controlling than by connecting or collaborating interventions. And that was also interesting. So, one of the examples here illustrated by a male nurse who worked in a closed ward, because we interviewed patients, nurses on open and closed wards in different hospitals all over Flanders. You see, he mentioned, but even when they say they would rather not, we do it anyway. It means seclusion or something like that. Then we emphasize, look, we want to protect you against your thoughts. So it's a sort of protection of control. And that was very common in the interviews. The core finding was also interconnected with three sub-elements: managing the risk of suicide, guiding patients away from suicide, and searching for balance in the minefield. I heard it also yesterday, how mental health practitioners always have to act with extreme caution and struggle with conflicting actions and aims. So on the one side, you want to provide safety, and on the other side, you want to avoid overprotection. So let's illustrate now this connecting or controlling approach by focusing on the managing of risk sub-element. So nurses consider it important to use, for example, suicide prevention protocols. They explained that these protocols provide guidance to assess suicide risk, assign a level of risk to patients, and carry out actions such as removing suicide means, locking doors, or enforcing seclusion, and performing formal observations by checking of patients, having standardized conversations with patients, and so on. And some nurses use protocols mainly to ensure a secure environment. But we also saw that other nurses indicated they are considerate towards using formal observations and protective measures. They emphasized that they only use these interventions in a way that still allows patients to feel that a human is interacting with them. a human who treats them as a person. So they stressed much more the sensitive way of being there for the patient, being approachable, being responsive to their needs, and so on. So we saw, in fact, two sorts of the controlling and the connecting, as I mentioned in the slide before. It's well portrayed here in this quote. I will also read it for you. Listening and saying, you are at the end. I see that you are tired or fighting, but look, I still see it for you. Or tomorrow, I will be back. Tomorrow we will see each other again. Saying such things really help. I believe such little things means a lot. Use their first name, say good morning, acknowledge them, validating them, laughing, wear makeup, and so on. Being attentive to notice it, to say something about it, and so on. But we also see that when there is lack of time, for example, sometimes this is a trigger to take control. And for other nurses, lack of time is, in the contrary, an impetus to make a greater effort to establish contact or connection. So we see very different things in the same situation. And that was also interesting. I will give now the word to Annelies to go on with the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Concluding, we could say the findings of Yuri emphasize that family members often feel trapped in a disempowered situation. They feel helpless and anxious about suicide. They experience burdensome responsibilities about it. And that's why they expect that mental health practitioners protect their relatives. On the other hand, we know that nurses are in that natural and even privileged position to assist and work together with the families, to work towards understanding each other, acknowledging their underlying hopes, their uncertainty. So that's a very nice position nurses have. As Bart mentioned already, isn't that in contrast with the recovery care, all that control, imposing security measures isn't really in line with the recovery care. But on the other hand, that's a tension mental health professionals feel all the time because they want to approach them more collaboratively. So our conclusion is we should acknowledge the lived experiences of family members more, and we should see family members much more as real partners in care. Of course, we have to admit that it is impossible nowadays to neglect procedural aspects of care. The boxes have to be checked from time to time. But unfortunately, as we mentioned already, policies could inspire nurses to primarily focus on using those instrumental approaches, and that's, of course, a pity. The concluding remark is for Bart.
Yeah. So we could finish by saying that an integrative and collaborative approach towards suicide prevention is crucial, and not only for nurses, but also for all who is involved in care for patients with suicidal ideation. An approach, for example, for nurses who can integrate a skilled suicide risk assessment within a foundation of interpersonal engagement and vice versa. So we're also taken into account, for example, sleep or rest or nutrition or activity or social interaction of patients with suicidal ideation. So they are a holistic approach, in fact. And nurse educators should review nursing curricula to ensure that they are based on a person-centered and collaborative paradigm. And the aim should be enable to broaden implementation of nurses who represent basic attitudes, such as demonstrating compassion or acceptance, interpersonal, reflective and collaborative skills. And policymakers and hospital leaders also must encourage the development of change in care in suicide prevention and the treatment of suicidal ideation. What means that we need strategic decisions on how and where to position nurses in the chain of care. For example, how nurses also can be offer a valuable contribution and low threshold community services, and how they can be involved in community-based teams to support people in the context of their daily lives, or work closely with general practitioners. And from a low threshold position, nurses can also expand their role in suicide prevention and the treatment of suicidal ideation. And they can, supported by nurse specialists who give confidence that they can do this, because this is also very important. Because nurses from themselves, they don't always believe in their capacities and their capabilities. And so I think this is really important. And so we need a health force work, or how do you say it, where for example, safety plans are co-produced, and crisis response plans with individuals and families together, and where nurses are there to be a coach for all who is involved. And and that's extremely important in Flanders, because in Flanders shame and stigma is still very, very, very common, and in relation to suicidal problems. So thank you for your attentive listening.
I think it's an excellent talk you gave. I like it, but can I ask you one question? Is it possible that the controlling nurse steps over to the other side? How would you promote that?
Q&A afterwards?
Do you prefer the Q&A? Okay, but then go to Carissa.
Let's give it a thought.
Yeah,
It's a very
we'll
good
come back to this.
question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Carissa, from you? Yeah. Will you also introduce yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Okay. It's the first time I'm on a conference, and also the first time I'm speaking English, so a lot of firsts for me today. I'm Carissa van Hoe. I'm here today to present you the research my colleagues and I conducted regarding the value of interpersonal engagement and the care for people experiencing suicidal crisis. The article that was written resulted from my master's thesis, and it was part of the larger doctoral study of my colleague Yuri van der Walle, and also Bart de Biezer was one of the authors involved. I'm a mental health nurse. I work at a psychiatric hospital Ons Lieve Vrouw in Bruges for 8 years now. And on the ward, we offer long-term and intensive treatment to people with serious and persistent mental illnesses. And the treatment is also called prestatieve zorg, or oyster care. For a year now, I work as a research assistant at Palliative Care Flanders to conduct research on oyster care. But no more about that today. In practice, I'm often confronted with people experiencing suicidal thoughts, feelings, or even suicide attempts. And I can use the insights of this research into practice, insights I would like to share with you today. It's a relatively small study, however, it demonstrates the power of interpersonal engagement. Throughout the presentation, and I follow the structure of the article, I discuss the meaning and impact of these patients' perceptions of engagement in relation to their suicidal crisis. The interpersonal relationship between a patient and a healthcare professional is considered the cornerstone of care for people in suicidal crisis. It is important for patients to have meaningful relationships with healthcare professionals in which they have timely, ongoing and supportive contact. And within clinical encounters, such engagement has been related to forming human connections, talking about suicide, conveying empathic understanding, and supporting coping strategies. And these processes, in turn, could inspire hope, nurture recovery, foster effective suicide risk assessments, and collaborative, preventative, and psychotherapeutic interventions. However, clinicians' efforts to prevent and treat suicide are often criticized for representing overly medical and risk-averse cultures, where they employ authoritarian positions and prioritize pharmacological, custodial, and observation-led interventions. And this might lead to people in suicidal crisis feeling misunderstood and approached based on only their medical symptoms and suicide risks, which needs to be managed and controlled. And the emphasis on medical and risk-averse practices often diminishes attention on interpersonal engagement. Now, an orientation on engagement seems natural for nurses and mental health workers. They often provide most of the direct care, and they have daily opportunities to talk about suicide and sense and respond to the patient's emotions. Simultaneously, nurses across the world experience their engagement with people in suicidal crisis as complex, demanding, and anxiety-provoking, and they might even refrain from asking patients about suicide or feel helpless regarding their ability to provide safe and helpful responses. And such findings reflect a sense of urgency across nursing domains. It indicates interpersonal and caring processes are under pressure and appear to be slipping away. We conducted research with an in-depth approach to understand the perspectives of people in suicidal crisis and to uncover concepts and processes that underpin their engagement with mental health nurses. It was a qualitative interview study based on grounded theory. We spoke with 11 participants from 6 wards and 3 mental health hospitals. The interviews were conducted from September 2019 to March 2020. We did not produce a saturated grounded theory. For such complex constructs like engagement, more participants needed to be selected. But as you can see, data collection ended in March 2020, first lockdown period. And due to the short time frame of the study and the sensitivity of the topic, we chose to not conduct interviews online. However, we did produce a coherent conceptual framework based on rich data and an analytic process fueled by intensive interpretation. Findings. So the research question was, how do patients in suicidal crisis experience their interactions with mental health nurses? The perspectives of patients were captured by the core process, feeling nurtured through an interpersonal engagement. This process underpinned 2 categories, feeling safe and cared for while struggling to trust, and working toward alleviation and change of my suicidal ideation. Patients began to engage with nurses they felt they could trust, nurses who made them feel safe and cared for, by demonstrating compassion, genuine involvement, and support to regain stability and security. These encounters provided a foundation to work with nurses toward alleviation and change. The nurses help patients express themselves and explore their suicidal ideations and develop new insights and ways of coping. When the nurses' engagement reflected this caring healing orientation, patients felt accepted and understood and hopeful to overcome their suicidal crisis. However, patients also encountered nurses who demonstrated compassion but lacked the capacity to promote their healing, or those who tried to interrogate or reframe their suicidal ideations without caring for them. Such limited responses could perpetuate their suffering, reinforce negative self-perceptions, and trigger distrust that disrupts engagement. So the first category was feeling safe and cared for while struggling to trust. I will show you some of the insights that emerged, along with some quotations of the participants. It included encountering compassion and genuine involvement, and regaining stability and security amidst the chaos I experience. Patients often dealt with experiences of shame and being misunderstood, for example, following a suicide attempt, that made them feel unsafe and worthless. With these experiences in mind, patients highlighted their encounters with nurses who demonstrated compassion and genuine involvement. In daily interactions, nurses appeared to converse with them as individuals and not just as patients, and showed interest in them beyond their problems. When needed, patients felt that nurses took the time to listen and demonstrated concern for them, verbally and non-verbally. They found it remarkable that nurses did not immediately judge them, but instead initiated contact, showed respect, and acknowledged and supported them in bearing their suffering. When considering this engagement as genuine, this enabled patients to take cautious steps toward building trust. They appeared to be worth investing in and accepted for who they are, instead of being a burden or a nobody who attempted suicide. However, patients perceived that some nurses ignored their suffering or only interacted with them as part of rigid observations, and such impersonal encounters made patients feel unsafe regarding the nurses' intentions, thereby increasing their difficulties in connecting with nurses, building trust, and therefore seeking help. I had not been to therapy. She was so concerned about me. It felt warm and genuine. This was evident by her expressions and the tone of her voice. It was as if she really missed me and believed that I am important. It is very difficult for me to trust someone, and then I felt like I was being attacked while talking to the nurses. I just started to express myself a little bit, and they were like predators waiting for me to give them something to jump on. Patients experience their suicidal crisis as a state of chaos in which their lives were consumed by insecurity and loss of control. These experiences emphasize their need for an environment in which they regain stability and security. For example, patients needed to feel secure enough to share their stories, especially given their tendency to hide or mask their suicidal experiences. A stable environment involved consistent nursing care and support. For example, when nurses were available, had regular contacts with them, and were well informed about their situation. In contrast, understaffing and nurse turnover contravened a stable environment. They then missed consistent support or had to talk to nurses they did not yet trust. Under these circumstances, patients felt alone in their suffering. Patients were more inclined to trust nurses and connect with them who represented stability and security. They wanted nurses to keep agreements about their engagement, such as respecting planned conversations, and this offered the justification that nurses were trustworthy. When nurses broke agreements, this triggered feelings that disrupted trust, such as anger, or negative self-perceptions, such as being unworthy. They share mixed feelings about safety routines. They indicated that it could make them feel stable and secure, but these feelings were nurtured when nurses remained close and were transparent about their measures, thereby offering emotional support and the possibility of retaining control. When nurses imposed safety measures on them, it exacerbated their chaos and insecurity. Although the nurses' impositions created distrust and were not attuned to their needs, the patients conformed to their actions rather than challenging them because they felt powerless. For a while, there were hardly any nurses because of vacations. Then I started to wonder if the mental health hospital was the right place. I really need that stability when I fall into chaos. I feel secure when an environment makes me feel safe. This gives me reassurance and confidence to work on myself. If an agreement is made, such as I will contact you again today, the nurse must not say, well, I intended to see you, but I completely forgot. Then I feel misunderstood and too important to be considered. The second category is working toward alleviation and change of my suicidal ideation, and it included being unable to express myself and my suicidal ideation, and being assisted in working through my suicidal crisis. Despite experiences of feeling safe and cared for, patients still felt vulnerable to expressing themselves to the nurses. They did not want to burden the nurses with their problems. Moreover, they had limited words to express their suicidal ideations and shared their suffering by withdrawing, being silent, or saying they felt unwell. They then stressed the value of nurses who reached out to them and were empathic enough to recognize and respond to their subtle communications. The nurses' sensitivity made them feel heard, and for some, this prevented them from attempting suicide. The nurses conveyed openness by initiating and inviting them for conversations about their suicidal ideations. So sharing their experiences was allowed and no longer taboo, and it made them feel accepted and understood. However, nurses needed to be sensitive to acknowledge that exploration of suicidal ideations was exhausting and could bring back painful memories, and they needed the nurses' closeness and support to contain their emotions. Patients perceived that some nurses did not truly help them to express their suicidal ideations. They did not initiate or avoided conversations about suicide or were startled by their suicidal experiences. This felt as if the nurses would not tolerate or know how to respond to their stories, thereby triggering a sense of alienation. Other nurses appeared to question them about their suicidal ideations without acknowledging their feelings. Such an approach created feelings of distress and insecurity, and some developed an aversion to such conversations. Both approaches, too limited or instrumental, could impede the patient's trust in nurses, leave them stuck in suffering, and trigger a tendency to not disclose themselves further. I had a connection with her, and she invited me. Let's have a conversation, because I see you are struggling. Then I was able to freely express my thoughts. If she had not noticed my situation at that moment, I am convinced that I would have attempted suicide. I informed that nurse about my suicidal thoughts, as she was completely shocked. I did not dare to talk about it anymore. I felt alienated and did not want to burden her. But with him, I was surprised that he did not have this reaction. I can trust him to share my thoughts, because I know he can work with me through it. Patients mentioned that there were periods during their suicidal crisis when they felt hopeless and unable to see alternatives to suicide. They then experienced assistance by nurses in developing alternative perspectives. They highlighted the nurses' positive encouragement, including those who expressed their belief in them, validated their efforts to get better, and helped them to become aware of positive signs. They also value nurses who assisted them in developing personal capacities and resources. Some had regular conversations with nurses in which they learned to identify and reflect on their suicidal ideations. The nurses' inputs helped them to expand their awareness of their crisis situation and organize and clarify their thoughts and feelings. Over time, these new insights helped them to turn their chaos into more coherent experiences, which enabled them to regulate their emotions. Additionally, some nurses co-constructed a crisis response plan, which enabled patients to de-escalate and cope with their suicidal crisis. Patients also refer to nurses who appear to lack an orientation or capacity to work with them through their suicidal crisis. Some seem to focus on instant solutions, such as merely offering advice or administering medications. Moreover, some nurses impose therapeutic regimes. They push them to follow therapies or talk about intimate issues because, according to them, this would contribute to their healing. First, patients tended to follow this therapeutic logic because they believed nurses had good intentions to help them get better. However, eventually, this felt as if nurses tried to reframe their suicidal crisis without caring for their needs or understand their suffering. Patients also mentioned nurses who demonstrated compassion, but simultaneously did not challenge their suicidal ideations. Over time, the dominance of compassion felt as if nurses pitied them and left them stuck in suffering. They seem to understand my situation and want to collaborate with me to work through it. They truly investigate where my suicidal thoughts come from. They ask me to explain why I see it this way and why I have these thoughts. I said to the nurse, I feel unwell, I cannot go to music therapy. But she ignored my feelings and forced me, you have to go, it will make you better. I felt completely misunderstood and went upstairs to write a farewell letter. So, the findings reflect the value of an interpersonal engagement that integrates caring and healing approaches. Feeling safe and cared for while building trust has a pivotal role for patients in becoming more open to working toward alleviation and change. This aligns with interpersonal theories indicating that patients can process and learn from experiences and interactions that allow them to feel stable, connected, and able to narrate. But this requires nurses to have advanced interpersonal and emotional competencies. They need to demonstrate compassion and empathy while being able to tolerate suicidal experiences and respond with understanding. The findings are consistent with the highlights of my colleague's systematic review, Fayuri. Persons with suicidal ideation and behavior want to interact with nurses who care for and acknowledge them as unique individuals, nurses who meet their basic needs, connect with them, and accept and understand what they are going through. And nurses can enable persons to give voice to themselves and their suicidality, and thereby create a nurturing space in which they can learn to cope with their suicidality and re-establish close ties with other people, services, and life itself. However, patients perceive that some nurses approach them in impersonal and instrumental ways, and such approaches could trigger insecurity and self-perceptions of being unworthy and burdensome. These findings are problematic given that perceived burdensomeness and feelings of being unsafe and disconnected might increase a person's suicide risk. Also, patients perceive that some nurses lacked an orientation or capacity to help them explore and reflect on their suicidal experiences. Limited or instrumental responses may leave patients stuck in concealment and suffering, while remaining dependent on others in managing their suicidal crisis, and it could intensify their difficulties in opening up, whereas talking about suicide might just reduce one's suicide thoughts. So we can conclude that caring for a person in a suicidal crisis As a process, it is an interpersonal endeavor that needs an integration of caring and healing approaches.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful, I think. You've also written it out, and it was a beautiful, beautiful paper. Yeah, it's exactly the heart of what we want to talk about. So let me repeat my first question to the first ones. How would you learn? Because if the protocols are that distracting from human interaction, can't we change the protocols? Or do away with the protocols?
Well, maybe I will tell you something from my experience. The hospital where Bart and me worked, and he still works there, has one of the managers is a very, very inspiring man. He's almost at the end of his career. At the end of next month, the end of June, he will stop working. But like 10 years ago, he said, we have to change that culture. That needs to change. But how could we do that? And he was first looking for one award in the hospital that was that wanted to be the pilot ward to change. And we were all very surprised because the pilot ward was the ward for the young people with psychiatric problems, the ward where there were used coercive measures all the time. They had, I told somebody yesterday evening too, 139 seclusions in a year in 2013. And still the head nurse and 2 nurses in the team were very eager to change the culture. One male nurse that was a little bit older, and the female nurse was a young one, and the head nurse, they were the 3 that were fighting for a cultural change. What was very important in that was that they were very good examples for all the other nurses. Next to that, they had the support of the director, the manager, who supported also a no-blame culture. So if something, didn't work out very well, nobody was blamed, but they were discussing how did it go wrong, what could we learn from it. That was a very important thing.
Are you saying that he picked the department where it was really wrong? So the worst department was chosen to be the beginning of the change?
Yes.
Okay, this is an old lesson.
Yeah.
We had someone in the Netherlands before, in old times. He
Yeah.
was called Van der Scheer. And he also said, if we want to do away with seclusion, we start with the ward where the most unrestful people live. Huh? You
Yeah.
start at the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
That's where you begin.
Yeah.
And if that works out, it needs a lot of attention, but there we start. So
Yeah.
this is a good point.
Yeah.
One point we have already.
Yeah, it
Okay,
was
so-
very good.
And what did the other nurses do?
Yeah.
Did they feel...
They didn't feel secure at first, but during that year, they looked at the good examples all the time, the dialogue the head nurse and the 2 others did all the time with the young people. Suddenly the head nurse also decided we remove the fence around our garden because the youngsters were climbing over it all the time to escape. They removed it and nobody ran away anymore. And the nurses who didn't believe in it at first saw that those changes worked, and they started to believe in it, and they started to try to dialogue more with the young ones. At the end of 2014, so that was 1 year later, you will not believe it, I think, but they had only 13 seclusions in a year. The year before, 139. I will never forget that. And all the time, the manager was always complimenting them on how they were doing and always trying to learn from it and not blaming anyone. So that was a very nice thing to feel. And they were the example for all the other wards, of course.
Are you afraid now he is going to leave? What will happen when he will leave?
Well, he has a good follow-up.
Okay.
She's also very nice. I think she can handle the same culture. But we know her only for since 2 weeks. We know that she will be his, how to say? Follow-up? Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not afraid. I think she could do it. Can I just say one thing more, Bart? And another thing that I was thinking, that's from my personal experience. My brother-in-law is somebody with psychosis, who suffers psychosis. And I was invited to the ward where he stays now, at least 10 times in the year 2021. And it was to have some conversations that we call, you know it for sure, open dialogue, from Jaakko Seikkula. That's the one from Scandinavia. And from my experience, I believe that the concept of open dialogue can also be very, very useful, or could be very useful to use for people with suicidal ideations. I'm sure of that.
Is everybody familiar with open dialogue? I don't think so. Maybe?
Yeah.
Can you explain it a little bit for
A little bit? Yeah, for sure. From the beginning of when he was on the ward, I think the second week already, everybody who was in connection with Brecht, with my brother-in-law, was invited to the ward. And we were sitting in a big circle with all his caregivers and we as a family, and we were discussing like all equals. He was there, of course, too. He was not well at that time. He left the room all the time, came back, left, came back. But still, we had that conversation for 1 hour, and we talked about how we look at the future for him. And it's very healing. Now we are already at a point that we have made a safety plan together. So yeah, it's fantastic. And I think to involve family members from patients with suicidal ideations, it would be a very nice concept to use too.
Is there anyone in the public who wants to ask about this? Yeah, Lindsay wants. I will give you a microphone because I. Oh, okay. Oh yeah, you should. Yeah, you should take my role. You mean?
You did very well. I'm happy to give some comments.
Okay. Okay. You come over here then.
Do you want me to?
Yeah. Okay. Later on, maybe I think there may be questions for Carissa, and then there's a comment written by Ian Marsh because of your written
I just want
text.
to add something.
Yeah.
Maybe it's also interesting. We also are experimenting in a certain way, but it's not experimenting. It's we experience that it works, but with also new ways of using, for example, new methods to put people in a situation where they experience oppression, like forum theater. That's also that's also a way that you can use because what was your question to
change the people who are controlling.
Sometimes the classic way is to discuss things and in dialogue and so on, but for example, using drama in ways in teaching and so on, and also you can use it also in the workplace. That also can help being more in tune with what people experience, and because you experience the oppression, and then you can resonate it with what you experience on your ward and so on.
Okay.
So I would like just to add.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anyone beside? Yeah, here's a question, but I asked Ian Marsh to comment. I sent him all your texts, so he has written a written comment. So that's also. So I asked you before, and Jantien has got one question.
Yes, I have a question to Carissa. Is responsibility an issue in the way nurses approach suicide? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more your study, the nurses' perspectives, but from practice, for sure, when something happens, I experience nurses are from, if something happens, we are responsible. For example, a patient who is suicidal or experienced suicidal ideations is feeling better, she wants to leave the ward to go outside, it's positive risk-taking. But some colleagues are saying, is this the time? Yeah, it's good to reflect the situation, but they are more like, no, she needs to stay inside a week more, or more like controlling, because they are responsible for the consequences. And the consequence is, yeah, you cannot change the consequence sometimes. Yeah, I think for sure, yeah. And moreover, when you were with not a lot of nurses, maybe you are with 2 nurses on the ward, how less people they are, how more responsible you feel, and how more you can be controlling, I think. When you are with a lot of people, you can discuss in team, and I think you can, it's more easily to do at positive risk-taking, or yeah.
Thank you.
I've got quite a lot of notes, and they're kind of on lots of different pages, so I try and keep it coherent. And I just say thank you to the... Okay. Cecile's been mentoring me with my speaking. Okay, yeah, I just say thank you to the speakers. They were really lovely studies, and they kind of highlight some of the excellent work that goes on, but in such a complex space, and a space that's quite problematic, I think, and hard to get right. But the kind of efforts to try and make things as good as possible, I think, is fantastic. I just kind of, in case you're wondering why I'm here and how I'm qualified to comment on your studies, I kind of justify that just very, very quickly. I worked 10 years in community mental health services, but I never worked in inpatients, but I did obviously have people I was working with in the community that were inpatients. So there's definitely limitations of what I say. I haven't done your jobs, and I always admire people that have been able to do that. And since I work clinically, I've kind of involved in a number of studies and different projects. And I think one of some of those that may be kind of relevant to your work is working with people, talking to and working with people that survived suicide attempts and have been inpatients, and trying to find out from them what they think is a good service, and what how services could be different. I also volunteer at Samaritans for a long time, so hear people in suicidal crisis. Often people talking about not wanting to be admitted again, experiences of having admissions in inpatients when they're being suicidal, and some of the kind of reasons they've found that difficult. Sometimes people obviously found it really life-saving and helpful to have had an admission, but other people very wary of being admitted again. And maybe the last bit of qualification I have is the last few years for various projects, mostly to do with suicide in public places. But I've been doing online ethnography, which is looking at how suicidal people themselves talk to each other in forums, in pro-choice forums. And on those forums, there's often recovery sections, and as well as people talking about methods. And again, what seemed to strike me from that work is just how hard it is to think of an environment that would kind of helpfully kind of support people when they're in a suicidal crisis. But again, a thread that comes through is how difficult admissions, people have found admissions to hospital many times. And again, this is the point I'm coming on to, not because of the nursing approaches or the individuals they've seen on the wards, but because there's something fundamentally problematic about that kind of involuntary, restrictive kind of approach. And I think your papers highlighted that really nicely, that if there's actually a system set up that you have to work in, one of those is that kind of protocol-driven. Part of it is that kind of the risk aversion that's built in. And I also thought when I was working clinically, and it resonates with me when people talk about that sense of anxiety and that sense of responsibility that you have when you're working with someone suicidal, and how in some ways your practice isn't always in the moment with that person, isn't interpersonal, but it's also, thinking about accountability for other kind of environments, about how you might be held to account for failings. And those tensions I remember very well. And as I said a couple of days ago, I remember the day I left mental health services, it felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, because that sense of responsibility and possibly being held to account. And they're very real systems. They're not, and it was interesting you were talking about, kind of a no-blame culture, which I think sometimes is fine to put forward as an idea, but there is still that accountability. And that can be through having your notes kind of taken and audited, having inquiries. But also, I don't know what it is in the Netherlands, but in the UK, the coroner's court is always quite present, I think, as a possibility to have to go to coroner's court with the family there and give an account of your actions and possibly be held to account. And I think that context has been built in from as soon as suicide becomes a medical issue, as soon as it becomes seen as a kind of mental health issue and you have hospitals. And it fundamentally creates a relationship with patients that has that kind of, I think, disempowering of patients and it's a very fraught role that clinicians then have to take up. So what I think I'm saying is that it's really admirable, the work that you've highlighted, and working with families and working with people going through crisis, but it's within a system that I think is already quite fraught and hard to see sometimes as healing and therapeutic. And it made me think about, okay, what is a healing and therapeutic environment for people that are suicidal? One I just ask as a question, and in the other one I try and give some answers. So in a way, the question, what might be a different therapeutic environment, I was wondering what you yourselves would consider that to be, if you are able, and I think sometimes you're quite powerless to change those systems of accountability and that anxiety that's around. But if you could, and it's a little bit like Cecile's question, if you were able to have kind of more control, what sort of systems, or what sort of environments do you think could be set up that were healing and therapeutic for people in suicidal crisis? The other way of answering that question is to think about what people who have been suicidal or are suicidal themselves, how they answer that question. And I'm involved in a couple of projects that are based around peer support and suicidal people kind of supporting each other. And often they're coming into the UK. I don't know about the Netherlands. But there's some interesting work done there. And I'm part of this Critical Suicide Studies network, and we have people with lived experience in that and kind of involved. And they're often involved in alternative to suicide groups. And there's some kind of, I think they work on some different principles than the kind of the medical kind of setup.
How did you found such a group? Do people who want to commit suicide like to meet another one who wants to?
Yes, I think that's the fundamental of it, and I think it's around acceptance of the suicide, the validation of a desire to die. And the forums are the same. And when people talk on the forums and talk about what the forum does for them, it seems to be fundamental that people accept that you have a legitimate right to want to end your life. And I think that's really challenging, and I think there's something intrinsically challenging about that as an idea. But it's there in clinical practice. And when with the interviews and people talking about, you know, when people listen to my suicidal thoughts, when they were kind of validated, how important that is. But there's limits within the current system about how much you can do that, because you're going to be held to account. You can't just say, yes, it's okay for you to die. You know, you can't let people do that. But the alternatives to suicide groups, the peer support groups, have that as a fundamental principle, that actually it is a legitimate choice in life.
Yeah, and then in Holland we also have a house where people can go.
Mm.
I think it's called the Evena, it's in Eindhoven. And there also people come and talk about their suicidal wishes, and it often ends that they don't do it.
And this is the key. Yeah.
It's very good to try.
Yeah.
I think it's...
And there's some crisis houses in the UK. There's like Maytree in London and other. There's one in Dublin and different places that have that. What I did do is I looked at, there's the Wildflower Alliance in the United States that is peer-led around alternatives to suicide groups, and they have just some principles. So this is my answer in a part. It's, you know, from what suicidal people themselves say would be a therapeutic or healing environment. So I thought I might just say what some of those are, and then just think about how that can be made more possible, or how that can be negotiated, given all the limits. So there's a kind of slightly different kind of language used, I think. So they talk about, similar to yourselves, you know, peer-to-peer support and genuine human relationships, alternative healing practices, learning opportunities, and advocacy as principles. And they say essential to our work is recognizing and undoing systematic injustices such as racism, sexism, ableism, transphobia, transmisogyny, and psychiatric oppression. Okay. Okay. Do you want me to say that again? Okay. So they're saying, I think what this is talking about, and there's some other ones coming up, is just the importance of how issues are framed. So I think what they're talking about is some of the things I talk about in my work, that when suicidality is framed just as an individual mental health problem, that framing itself positions people in particular ways. When you frame suicidality in a more contextualized way, I think it opens up different possibilities for conversations and relationships. And in some ways, it's about attribution, I think. So that if you frame it as an individual, suicidality as an individual mental health problem, the problem is you've then got someone, it's a fault in the person that needs fixing. If you frame it in a more contextualized way, the attribution of where the suicidality comes from gets much more placed external to the person. And I think that's fundamentally therapeutic. It's almost like a narrative therapy idea, that kind of external attribution takes a lot of pressure off the person. So I think there's something around the psychiatric kind of framing that could be problematic. So what they were saying, the Wildflower, I'm sorry, I'm now slowing down consciously, saying is that context of systematic injustices is important in suicidality. So things like racism, sexism, ableism, transphobia. So they talk about a founding principle being mutuality, okay? So mutuality means a focus on the connections between us, which is a good practice, I think you were highlighting, that kind of in it together kind of mutuality. And they say we all have the potential to give and receive support and to learn from and be impacted by one another. We aim to build relationships and community that considers each person's needs and our collective ability to create together. But I think what that is suggesting, and the other ones that are coming up, is an equality of relationship that might be therapeutic, that is necessarily absent when you have a power relationship based on coercion and involuntary admission and restriction. So they say there are no fixers and people being fixed within our community. So it's a move away from the traditional kind of relationships we've talked about. So they say we will not act as therapists, caseworkers or healers. It is assumed that all people who become a part of the Wildflower Alliance, this peer support group, for support or learning, will also pass that benefit along to others in some way. So I think it is a different kind of relation of power within that. Each of us has the potential to move, question, change, act, teach, or lead and share. In doing so, we also have the potential to inspire others to do the same. And we seek out opportunities to raise up marginalized voices. Okay, so then they talk about healing environments. What makes a healing environment? Privacy is respected. We can share the lessons we learn from one another, but should leave behind any personal information. This is interesting, I think. It is always someone's personal choice when and how they share parts of their own story, even if they've shared something publicly in the past. So the importance of privacy. We strive to make spaces as accessible as possible. That's around language and accessibility, physical accessibility. And they say the impact of trauma on our lives is real, and I think there's, again, the framing around that people are experiencing the difficulties in their life often because of what's happened to them rather than what's wrong with them. And so I think that kind of trauma-informed approach can be important in the kind of the principles. So, and they say, in creating trauma-sensitive environments, it is important that we are mindful of how our choices affect others. This includes paying attention to how we say things, such as tone, volume, assumptions, and creating shared agreements to address community needs as they arise. So there are lots. I just read maybe one more, and this is again that idea about how issues get framed and the importance of that. So they say we are committed to creating environments that acknowledge and work to undo all types of systemic oppression. We strive to achieve this through a mix of setting limits, creating learning opportunities that include asking us to examine our own privilege and power, and supporting one another to understand how we've come to believe what we believe. And then the last one I'll talk about. We all have responsibility for caring for the spaces we hold within our community. So I think they're principles about relationships, so that's kind of interpersonal. But within a system, if you like, or a set of principles that includes an acceptance that people might choose to die, even within that support, and accepting that. And they're spaces that are created as alternatives to statutory care, if you like. So the woman I know, Jess, in Colorado, in Denver, that runs one of these, she says, yeah, it's difficult. You have to accept that people might die in that group, that people might choose to do that. But you have to have that risk in order to create a space where people feel that they can be themselves and open up to kind of that support. But I do wonder whether that would ever be possible within a statutory, what I would say a statutory space where you are held accountable. So they were my reflections really, just on what was said.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile.
He's a retired nurse, actually, and he's doing the rehabilitation work. He's written the last work, and I think it's a good one. He has confirmed a new practice for the people from Fontys Hogeschool who are here. It is in Helmond, and it's very nice. It's called Nijskoen, and it's a kind of walk. Nijskoen, and it is nieuwe schoenen. Yeah, nieuwe schoenen, Nijskoen it's called. And it's a wonderful place. It's behind a bank, and it's not a real fancy building, but there are people coming in there, they're chronic patients, and they can walk in there, they can make music, but they start the day with a kind of round table, and they tell their problems, and it is a wonderful, equal space. Nothing is prohibited. Everybody who wants to come in can go there. Also, you don't have to be a patient, but no one is refused. And Dirk den Hollander is leading that. And there's one other guy, but they are not really leaders. They are just there, and they create the space that it's all possible. But it's a wonderful project, and I think this is really exact like what you are telling about, but it's not that all these people want to die, of course, but it's the same thoughts. So that's what I wanted to add. You want to ask something? Jij wil iets vragen aan Ian? Aan de sprekers. Okay, the sprekers are asked to get back here because there are questions in the room. Ja, jij komt ook aan.
Thank you for sitting there. I'm also a nurse practitioner, mental health, and I wondered if you were familiar with my colleague Hans van der Weijden. He's also a nurse practitioner, mental health, and he made a course for family who had a person who committed suicide or had suicidal behavior. And it's a course from Taiwan. And he made it specially translated for the Dutch people. But I didn't know if you were familiar with him. To give the family a course for one evening. And the family said afterwards they were happy to talk about it, but also feel more comfortable and not that restrictable to their family or their relatives. So that was my first thing. And the other thing was, in your ward in Belgium, are they also familiar with rooming in from family in the ward? So they can...
Yeah. Not on my ward, but I think on the high intensive care wards, they are, well, maybe you know more about it?
There is a hospital in Flanders, Sint-Niklaas, St. Hieronymus. It's a famous hospital where they do many projects to involve family members. And they have very chronic patients in a certain way. People were very disturbed, for example, and then people can also, for example, when people have to be secluded, families can be there for them. That's the project I remember from them. Yeah.
It's not common. No.
But
Okay. Okay. Tamara, you wanted to ask a question?
I would rather make a comment on a bit of Ian's comment. I think the key of making a therapeutic environment in general is to listen to patients or people in general. I think it's not necessarily a problem of only healthcare professionals, but society in general. People tend to judge in the sense of when someone is telling about a problem, we tend to say, oh, it could be worse. Oh, it could be also like that. So people feel often that they are not seen, that they are not listened to, and I think that is the key in not only preventing suicide, but also preventing all other various mental problems. Because I think the biggest problem we are dealing with here is the taboo. People are scared to talk about it. So I think if you really want to create a therapeutic environment in which people feel welcome, the key is to listen and ask why. Why are you feeling this way? What are your reasons? Not saying, oh, it could be worse.
Okay. Yeah, that's a nice comment. Thank you.
that's also
Yeah.
why it's so important that also hospital leaders, for example, are very approachable for healthcare practitioners. So, because you also are sometimes overwhelmed by what you experience in your work, and then if you have managers, hospital managers or ward leaders who are there for you, or there is intervision, and all these things are set up, then it's much more easy to find relief in the way you cope with it, and so you can go on with what you, because I think nursing is a demanding job, and it's we experience so much things during one day, and it's hard to handle this also, and so they need also very well be supported. So, and that's the message for hospital leaders, in fact.
Do you want to finish your comment if you were going to finish?
Because I got during we were talking, I got a publication, I think from somebody in the public, yeah, about nursing leadership. That is very important, of course, in those processes of change. And I want to say what Bart says, it's a parallel process. If the manager gives you the space to discover and to try some things, then you will give the same space to the patient. And just the normal nurses on the ward should stand up and try these things and try to be a leader and
Usually they do not dare to do so.
No.
There are also managers who ask them not to. Often when there's a lot of problems in the ward, people get their mouths closed.
Shut,
And they are not allowed to talk. So there's a problem there. Chris Miller, what would you
Thank you so much for your talks. I'd like to ask about power, if I can. We talked a little bit about the privilege of nursing staff and the way that there is a sort of an experience and expertise and some authority. And I wonder how this interacts with co-producing care plans or crisis plans, having, listening to patients, listening to what they want. Because at some point there has to be a limit. There has to be a limit to what a patient wants or does not want to do. And I sometimes feel that a lot of this very well-meaning and very progressive emphasis on we must listen to patients and we must be as accepting as we can, when that starts to press against ideas of harm and damage and ideas of maybe irresponsible life choices, the listening stops, and it has to stop in a way because somebody is considered to be doing damage to themselves. And I just wanted to think a little bit more about power and how actually, as much as we might want to listen to patients who are in crisis, there is also a very secure idea of what is damaging or what is irresponsible or what is harmful, and that does cut across this idea of listening. So I just wanted to ask you what you think about that.
For my research, the participants said, okay, there are periods that I experience as a loss of control, and I really need that stability. And they need nurses who offer that stability by saying, for example, you can't leave the ward this weekend, we have to protect you to your impulses. And the participants, one said, that's okay, it was good afterwards. At the moment I thought, is this necessary? But afterwards I thought it was okay, because she said to me why it was needed and if it was okay for me. And it was a negative moment that I couldn't leave the ward, but it was a positive moment with her, and it's let the trust growing, and she felt more connected with the nurse. And another participant said, I couldn't leave the ward, but I was waiting whole day, can I leave, can I not leave? And I asked the nurse, and she said it like in the middle of the hallway, oh, you can't leave this weekend because this or that. And she felt like, oh, that was so important for me, and all the other patients saw and heard it, and that was not okay. So it's okay, you do measures, but the way you do it, it's very important. Yeah.
Okay, there are questions raised up. Can you handle the phone to Mark?
Thanks, mate. Might we consider a follow-up question? You said in your presentation, or maybe in one of the answers, that there's still 13 cases of seclusion and isolation, down from more than 100 a year. Would you consider that a valid use case? Was it, in those 13 cases, the best available care, or is it something that you still aim to eliminate?
I think it was 2013, 2014, so I don't remember all the details, of course, but I know that many of the times that the nurses decided not to do a seclusion, afterwards they thought we'd better done it. Yes, that was one of the things I remember very good. And it was the first year, so it was really trying. From the 13 they did, they could also mention some of them were not useful. So both were the case, yeah.
I think we have to stop now because there are some people who are taking trains and they want to go. So, and it's time because the next session will be as interesting as this one. So we're taking coffee break. Okay. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sarah Waters is coming first. She will. Sarah. Yeah. Sorry. I give you the word. Sorry. Don't worry.
That's the academic paper, it's not the PowerPoint. I thought I might have that. Give me a couple of minutes. This is not the right? No, that's the paper, it's not the PowerPoint.
So do you want me to get started? Thanks very much. My name's Sarah Waters from the University of Leeds. It's been such an interesting and friendly and well-organised conference over the past few days. Thank you so much to the organisers. I don't think any of us want to go home. I don't think I want to go home. So before introducing the next two presentations, I'm just going to make some preliminary comments on the theme, Caring for the Caregivers, Suicide by Nurses. So over the past few days, we've heard about the essential role of nurses in caring for suicidal individuals, in supporting families, in intervening in a moment of profound crisis in an individual's life, in a family situation. I'm going to change, in my comments, I'm going to change the perspective by looking at nurses as potential subjects and victims of suicide who themselves need to be cared for. And my comments draw on my research on work-related suicide. So suicide whereby an individual, in the face of extreme pressures of work, chooses to take their own life. Pressures which may relate to the structural context of work, to poor working conditions, or relational factors, social relations at work. My research has focused on France. I'm a professor of French studies, and so I looked in detail at 66 cases of suicide between 2005 and 2015, and I analysed the suicide notes or suicide letters to look at how individuals themselves describe the factors which push them to such an extreme act. And more recently, we have done qualitative work on suicide cases in the UK. So my notes are a little bit all over the place. Yeah, so a few words on work-related suicide as a phenomenon. Employment, we know that employment and having a job can be a protective factor against suicide. Yet the majority of suicides today occur amongst working age adults, many of whom are employed at the time of death. And just to give you a few statistics, in the United States, over the past 2 decades, suicides amongst working age adults have increased by 40%. In Japan, to take another example, the phenomenon of karojitsatu, or suicide by overwork, is considered an urgent public health priority on which the government has passed legislation. In France, to take another example, a government report from last year found that 10% of all suicides across the population are work-related, were deemed to be linked primarily to work-related causes. So, turning to nurses, what do we know? What is the situation regarding suicides in the nursing profession? We know that nurses are at higher risk of suicide than the general population, and are more than 4 times more likely to die by suicide than people in any other profession. In the UK, the Office for National Statistics has set out the suicide rates across the medical profession, and it lists 33 categories of occupation, everything from hospital porters to paramedics to medical secretaries. Of those 33 categories, nurses have the second highest rate of suicide. The highest suicide rate is amongst home carers and carers more generally. So again, the very high incidence of suicide within the caregiving profession. Between 2011 and 2018 in the UK, 360 nurses took their own lives. So what are the causal factors or stressors behind nursing suicides? Recent studies, and there aren't very many of them, have shown that working conditions and structural factors are very important. Long hours, irregular working patterns, high levels of work-related stress. Nursing is one of those professions where you are exposed on a daily basis to human suffering, to human trauma, and the psychological effects that can have. One of the cases that we did look at in our UK study involved a 35-year-old mental health nurse who was working in a high dependency unit. And she wrote a very detailed suicide note. We also looked at the coroner's reports and studied the full documentation linked to her case, talked to family members, talked to colleagues. And those working conditions were very evident in her case because she was working 12-hour shifts. She had very irregular working patterns, and the sense of how that disrupted and destabilized other parts of her life. And she felt, as she expressed in her letter, that she couldn't have a social life, she couldn't start a family because work had really encroached on every other aspect of her life. Suicide by occupation is a gendered phenomenon. The highest rates of suicide by occupation are amongst both male-dominated and female-dominated occupations. So amongst men, construction is the obvious, is the classic example. Also amongst skilled trades. Amongst women, nursing and the caring professions in the UK, also amongst primary school teachers who are in the majority women. So there is, I think it is complex and it is beyond structural factors. There has been work recently on emotional labour and the impact of jobs which require emotional labour. By that I mean jobs which go beyond technical skills, professional expertise, nursing, teaching, etc., that require an investment of emotional and psychological resources, that require something beyond the technical and professional boundaries of a job. And certainly in the UK, there has been increasing research on doctor suicide. There has been increasing resources put into preventing and understanding suicide amongst doctors. Nurses have been somewhat neglected within the medical profession, both in terms of research and suicide prevention resources. So I think more attention given to the specific nature of nursing, both the structural pressures, the working conditions, but also the emotional labour aspect of the job and how we can use that to inform suicide prevention methods and measures and improve working conditions for nurses. I'm now going to move on to introducing, I think they've already sort of been introduced, but I'll do it again. So our first paper is going to be presented by Alison Van Laar and Peter Murphy. Alison Van Laar, registered mental health nurse who is currently Director of Mental Health and Learning Disability Care in a large NHS trust in Somerset. Peter Murphy, a senior clinical psychologist within the Irish Health Service Executive and works in adult mental health in Galway University Hospital. Both of them are keenly interested in suicide and suicide prevention. And the title of their paper, Balancing Between Care for Suicidal Patients and Prevention of Impact of Service Users' Suicides on Mental Health Professionals. Thank you very much.
Is this working? It is working. Thank you, everybody. And what we'll do, we'll start off by just introducing ourselves a bit more. So my name is Alison Van Laar. You can see I have a Dutch surname, Dutch father, no Dutch. All my cousins speak perfect English, but I never really learnt it. So myself and Peter, so Peter was a colleague of mine when I was staying in Ireland. I'm now back in the UK. And I was an advanced nurse practitioner in liaison psychiatry in Ireland. So my job every day was assessing risk. And in mental health and psychiatry, we assess two risks, first of all, which is, are you going to kill yourself or are you going to kill somebody else? So that was the prime bit of my job when I was working in liaison psychiatry. So myself and Peter, we did peer supervision together, and we were identifying the amounts of suicide and trying to look back at the suicide and having time to reflect on patient suicides. We did some work, we looked at the psychosocial characteristics of people that had died by suicide. We did that by looking through the post-mortem books. It's quite an odd experience to do that, but just to do almost like that psychological autopsy by going back and seeing what people were doing. And it led us to start thinking about, well, what support do we get and what support do our colleagues get when there is somebody who dies by suicide? So that's why we primarily started this study. So, I don't know if you want to say anything, Peter. I'm hogging the mic.
You're fine on the mic. I think I can be heard. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I'm passionate about this area. The other thing is with any kind of trauma, if the person starts telling you a story, that's probably a good thing from a therapist's point of view, because it means you're probably hitting on the trauma. You've moved away from those skills that we talked about earlier. So the trauma for me and for lots of people was that a person died by suicide. And I was wondering where my training was for that. How was I prepared in training? I've been trained in Ireland and in the US, and it wasn't part of my training. And then where to go if this happens. So I asked around. I was wondering if it was something remiss in my own personal development plan, but no, people had not been trained at that time in Ireland. So we followed up on that with a study. Alison and I are both big talkers. So Alison's going to do most of the talking today, so just in terms of watching the time. But that's what's behind it. We've got some policy changes in. We've got a shift in culture. Everything that people said about the interpersonal is the important. It's not the protocols. But we do have a protocol because you push the culture by introducing the protocol into the culture of protocols. And then you get people talking, you get the employee support involved, and you get a better service for the service provider. If the service provider is not under undue stress themselves, they provide a better service. And we are, in my work, we're civil servants, we work for the Irish state, so our job is to serve people as best we can, and we can do that if we're not totally stressed out ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to go through the study and go through the results of the study, but I'm also going to do this from the point of view of a nurse. So I've been a qualified psychiatric nurse for 30 years this year, a long, long time. And I can honestly say I would never do a different job. I love being a nurse. I'm very passionate about promoting nursing and the speciality of nursing. And earlier on today, there were three words mentioned, and then Chris mentioned power, so that sent me off for different things. So we're not going to talk about power, but 3 words were mentioned in the talks earlier. One was about reflection, and as a psychiatric nurse, I have the freedom to reflect. I have lots of nurse friends who work in A&Es and cardiac and oncology, and they say to me, "But all you do, Ali, is you sit and you talk to people." And I said, no, I'm doing, well, no. All you do is you sit and you talk. And I said, I'm so lucky in my job to have the freedom to do that, to sit and talk with my patients, with my colleagues, actually think about what we do. The other thing that was mentioned in the talk earlier was about the nurse-patient relationship, and in mental health in particular, the nurse-patient relationship is the crux and the key of everything that we do. So nurses are on the ward 24 hours a day. Psychologists come and go, occupational therapists come and go, doctors come and go, but the nurse is there 24 hours a day at the side of the patient and at the side of a suicidal patient. And the word burden was used earlier, and it can be a burden to be that nurse, and particularly when you think about the risk of the nurses being at risk of suicide themselves. And the other last word that was said was about the privilege, and I feel extremely privileged to be a nurse working with people with psychiatric illnesses. And I'm proud of being a nurse, and I think that when I love speaking to new student nurses, talking about, you were so lucky to embark on this journey of having the privilege of working with people with mental health problems. So that's where I'm coming from. And when I'm talking about this today, again, what we did is we asked all of our staff to think of the most significant suicide that they'd experienced in their life. And as we're talking about this today, I'm thinking of 2 people. And one is a young woman called Hyacinth, and I trained in the Maudsley Hospital in London. I don't know if you know it. Right next door to the hospital is a railway station, and I vividly remember her waving goodbye and then walking to the railway station and jumping under a train. And then fast forward a couple of years, and I think of a young man called Ethan, who I was on the phone to his mum. I was a ward manager in Greenwich in London, of a ward that had a small intensive care area, and Ethan had been brought on to the ward by the police because he was psychotic, and I was on the phone to his mum saying, "We will look after your son," and as we were doing that, he was hanging himself from a door. And so when I think of suicide, those 2 are the people I think of. And unfortunately, in my job at the moment, I lead on governance, and leading on governance also means leading on serious incidents, and we have probably 2 to 3 suicides a month in Somerset, but I don't remember them, but I also always remember Hyacinth and Ethan. So when I do this work, they're in my mind. Okay, so on to the actual study. So if you look on any of the literature, what they say are helpful staff supports are these things. I think everybody would say that this is probably the same across all areas of nursing and all different areas. It's not just in mental health. But it's really important to have debriefing, case reviews, team meetings, have time again. We get back to reflection, and it's all about reflecting. And then if you look at the literature again, it's people are feeling these things, guilt, sadness, shock, all the things, again, you expect to feel when a significant event has happened. So we had 508 questionnaires. We had a 35% response rate. We took all of the staff working in the large teaching hospital in the west of Ireland. And that was, we had consultants, we had nurses, we had occupational therapists, we had social workers. And we decided to look at everybody to see if it was different for everybody, or is it, we had more nurses than we did occupational therapists, say, for example. We just wanted to sort of capture a snapshot of everybody. This is just about the gender of the staff. So what surprises me of those numbers is how many did not experience a service user suicide. And I think that it's the interpretation of the question, because I think most staff working in psychiatry will have experienced a suicide, but maybe not feeling that it was their experience. It could be back. And anybody that works with suicide and suicidal patients understands that suicide is like putting a big stone in a puddle of water. There's ripples that go out everywhere, and the family and the people working with that person at the stone, but then there may be other people way out here that don't actually recognise it and feel it as having an impact on them. And this was just the breakdown of the different people we had. And then we asked them, what support did you have post-suicide? And one of the reasons that Peter and I decided to look at this, because there really wasn't very good support at all. So a suicide would happen, and then it would be talked about a little bit, not in a formal way, and then you just expected to get on with the job and just go through it. If you were lucky, you could sit and talk and reflect again with your colleagues and your peers, but not always, not everybody. And certainly the ward nurses, if a suicide happened for patients in the community, but the patient had been an inpatient on the ward, were never included. So it was very much ad hoc. And then we looked about how many staff were formally trained in risk assessment. And as expected, the majority were, but not every discipline has formal training in suicide risk assessment. I did as a nurse, and I'm presuming nurses do everywhere, but I think other disciplines don't necessarily. And again, so we're looking at it was fairly evenly split, 53-43 male-female suicide, and the primary group within that 26 to 40, which, you know, as we know, is a prime age for suicide. Then when we look at methods, so in the hospital in Ireland, literally across the road is the river. And so whereas drowning appears high here, in Somerset, say, or in London, we wouldn't actually see drowning as a high cause. Whereas in Ireland, it's very easy because you literally come out of the hospital and you're in a fast-flowing river. Hanging, which I think is the same everywhere, certainly back in England now, hanging is the primary cause. It's such a lethal cause as well. And overdose of medication or poisoning. We're also in Galway, it's a mixed rural, urban area. Lots of farmers, lots of weapons, lots of guns, shotguns around. But not very many high buildings. So jumping from buildings, road bridges is not so common there. And just looking about the time since the suicide, I remember this is people asking people to recall the most significant suicide for them. And again, it's a mixture. So if the more recent is, they're probably easier to recall it. Ethan and Hyacinth were 25 and 29 years ago, but I still recall them. And 31 of them were an inpatient, and no, 31 were an inpatient and 52 were an outpatient. So again, it's a mixed bag of the suicides. A lot of the outpatients would have been inpatients at one time as well. Now, this isn't so easy to read, but if you look about the personal impact, in red are the primary things, and it's sadness, surprise, and shock or disbelief. And I think that when staff experience a patient's suicide, we also need to be able to feel sad and to be able to grieve. And again, we go back to the importance of reflection, having that opportunity in a safe place to be able to reflect and to grieve for the death of a patient. The other thing, of course, you get a heightened awareness of risk. So when I was in my liaison psychiatry role, if a patient had we assess them as having a medium risk, not a risk that needed them to stay in hospital. If something happened, you become, your positive risk taken is reduced because you're starting to panic and you feel fearful. And then you have to recalibrate yourself actually and just sort of say, actually, no. One thing we can't do, we can't see inside somebody else's head and we can't tell exactly what's going to happen and we don't know. I think the thing with psychiatry is very subjective. I think we can use assessment tools all the time, but at the end of the day, we don't know. They only tell us part of the story, don't they? And then these are some of the quotes that we had from staff about the patient, the service user's personal circumstances, the therapeutic bond, and the feeling of guilt. And I think those comments would be fairly the same if we did this in the Netherlands, we did it in lots of other countries. I think nursing staff and clinical staff feel the same thing, really. I think this one about the therapeutic bond, again, that's going back to that nurse-patient relationship and how close you can become to a patient and how much a patient will share with you. And that feeling that, you gave a lot. And feeling, the normal stages of grief as well with a patient. They're feeling angry towards the patient and sad about the patient's death. And feeling guilty. And we all try and have a no-blame culture, but we all know that if you were the last person to see that person, you have some blame. You probably know in your mind you didn't do anything wrong, however you still feel it, and you never forget that feeling. and shock. And I think all of us have been shocked when we've heard that a patient has ended his life, and you think, oh my God, that person was just having a great life, or starting anew, or so positive, and there was hope. And then to feel that somebody has died because they didn't feel the hope that we felt for them, that they didn't necessarily feel. And I think the second one, the therapeutic relationship, that was a consultant psychiatrist saying, working really closely. And I think sometimes we forget that psychiatrists and consultants also feel the same feelings that we have. They're not necessarily working as closely with patients as nurses do on the wards, but they still have the same feelings and sadness. And I think the last one about the superficial engagement, who don't feel that you've got an insight into how she really feels. People are only going to tell us what they want to tell us. We can't make people tell us things. And people, in my experience, what they don't want to do is they don't want me to stop them leaving hospital. And we were talking a little bit about this earlier, about power. I'm going off at a tangent again here. But as a nurse working in an NHS hospital, I can stop you leaving legally. And I'm the only nurse in the hospital that can do it. As a psychiatric nurse, as a general nurse, you can't do it. So it's very much about that power relationship that we have. And I think, again, we go back on to reflection. And again, I bang on about reflection all the time, about how important it is, really. And I think we do think that. You go through and you think about what happened and what didn't I do and what did I do and could I have made a difference? Could I have changed the outcome of this? And it's about sort of thinking about, what can I learn from this and move on to the next patient and the next case. And then we talk about changes in professional practice. And I think it is very much, like I say, it's about you do become less likely to take positive risks or more fearful of taking positive risks, really. And I think the desensitization is very true. So when I was working in liaison psychiatry, we would see up to 13, 15 people a day working in the emergency departments and on wards, and you become very desensitized to it, and you have to be really cautious and careful about that. And again, we're talking about support, so the importance of having a debrief or having some time for people, the relevant people, to get together. And the people that you think are relevant might not be the relevant people. So again, it's a bit like that stone in the pond. There are other people in the wider circle that may have been affected by that particular suicide. And it's about considering those as well. So, conclusion really is that we understand that a patient's suicide impacts mental health professionals, and that's across all the disciplines, personally and professionally, both a positive and negative way. And I think that the important thing is what we were saying, like we were saying earlier, it's important to have that open dialogue and talk about it, and offering and developing support for staff so that they do have that opportunity to reflect and learn from the events. So I think, like I say, it's important to improve the awareness and think about the wider pool of people that are affected by patient suicide. Very much more open communication about it, and need to have this open dialogue about cultures where, say, for example, in the Netherlands, where you do have the euthanasia, compared to Ireland, where it's a very Catholic country, and the stigma and everything else that goes with the suicide in Ireland is an interesting mix, really. So I don't know if Peter wants to say something?
Yeah, just to add to that, the mandatory training is nearly 100% now, so people are getting trained. The other thing is we've started to go into the colleges in the last few years. This is a couple of years old, to undergrads and to clinical psychologists in training. You do a piece on what you think yourself about the right to die, your feelings on suicide. It's done sensitively. We have safety pieces in place, obviously, for that. There's a piece on training, including talking about this work here, on what it's going to be like for you should this happen, and it likely will in your career. And then there's other pieces on self-harm, and where self-harm does and does not overlap with suicide. There's also pieces on trauma and trauma focus. I think Lucy Johnson is someone I've read. If you haven't read her, it's definitely worth looking her up. This is quite easy to find. But there's a whole other piece around connecting properly with people. I loved the talks because everyone was talking about that. There's a piece on safe wards as well, which is starting to come in. There's things like mutual expectations. I expect that you don't break the furniture, the staff might say, and that the service user might say, I expect that you don't treat me like you know what. So there have been a lot of changes in the last few years, as there has been in all over the world. There's change, but to try and get it knitted into the culture is important. And then the people that participated in the study, including the researchers, were from several disciplines. And if we're not working together, then we're not changing the culture, because it can be great for psychologists to do their psychology thing, nurses to do their nursing thing, occupational therapists to do their thing. If we're not working together on the wards and in the community, we're not providing the best service that we're capable of providing for service users, and we're not looking after ourselves as well as we ought to, because some of our supports came across discipline. So and informal supports from colleagues, as you all know. These are the human beings in your life. These are your family away from your family. And if you have a culture where people are afraid to do anything, or afraid to act, or afraid to take positive risks, with this type of an approach, you allow more openness around that and support, so people aren't as afraid to look after people as best they can. And then, as has been said already, people do make choices. We might not agree with their choices. We're contracted to have them not undertake that choice. But we'll have done the best that we could do, made those human connections, followed our protocols, and hopefully we get a better service, whether it's in Galway or in the Netherlands or wherever it might be. So that's it from myself anyway.
I'll just introduce you to the PowerPoint. How do I get the PowerPoint? So just wait till I've got
questions at the end of the two presentations. So thank you very much to the first two speakers. That was a really, really interesting and very moving presentation I found, and I'm very interested. I'm sure there'll be lots of comments and questions afterwards. I certainly was very interested in more about some of the things you mentioned. We're now going to pass on to Julie Godwin, who's Professor of Modern History at the University of Sheffield. She is the author of 2 monographs on women in politics in the interwar period in Britain. Her current research examines an epidemic of crisis suicides in Britain on the eve of the Second World War, and the title of her paper is on the screen, Suicide in Times of Crisis, Lessons of History for the COVID Pandemic. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you. Is this microphone working? Well, okay, thank you. So back to history. We end with history. We've had some brilliant and very insightful discussions of very current practice, which always makes me feel very useless and inadequate. But I'm going to use hopefully some of my historical knowledge and reflections to see if they are useful for thinking about framing and possibly even impacting policy and practice in dealing with suicide and suicide prevention. So here we are in late 2020, in the spring of 2022, slowly, undecidedly, and haltingly emerging from chronic world crises and global pandemic, and in the middle of another crisis that touches us deeply, but for most of us, we are experiencing it vicariously, namely the invasion of Ukraine. Living in the UK, since 2016 and the EU referendum, I found it too easy to draw analogies between the 1930s in Britain, the period that I study, and our present. I'm not suggesting that there is any kind of perfect symmetry here of unfolding events, but rather that the emotional, the affective, and the psychological repercussions of political crises are frighteningly familiar. It is the emotions evoked and the emotional states experienced that echo from past to present. What are these psychological parallels then? They're a sense of perpetual crisis, vying with crisis fatigue, living in suspended animation, unescapable uncertainty about the future of family, business, career, home, belonging, and the self, and mounting feelings of hopelessness. These are all examples about how political crisis is internalized. Now, in the early days after that fateful vote in 2016, the reason that I now share a queue as a Canadian with my British friends, I sensed an immediate reaction, though, that clearly internalized this highly divisive and seismic political event. And I wondered whether we could see this as an outbreak of what I wanted to term post-referendum depression. Those much better qualified than me soon began to diagnose, to study, and to treat the condition that has come to be called Brexit anxiety disorder. This Brexit-triggered anxiety and depression, and in some case is linked, as I say, to anxiety and depression, and in some extreme cases it is also linked to suicide and suicidality. Now, since the referendum, the advent of the Trump presidency, and now the war in Ukraine, modern historians have been doing, I think, a roaring trade in drawing analogies with the 1930s. Like a house of cards, however, it doesn't always take much to show how shaky connections are between past and present. There are all kinds of outside pressures on us to demonstrate historical patterns and to offer our scholarship as some kind of prism of prediction. That note of cynicism aside, though, I feel strongly that we can be forgiven for noting these disturbing parallels. And it's this awareness, this seemingly a fresh welcome, a new openness to mental health, too, and the allowances that are made for anxiety that leads us to, I think, ask new questions, not only about our present, but very much about the 1930s. Now, it's at this moment in time, and from this vantage point, when Britain's EU referendum has been kicked into the long grass of foggy memory by the mental health effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's at this moment that I would like to reflect even more. At a press briefing in January 2021, the British Prime Minister said approximately £12 billion had been spent on NHS mental health care, with around 19 to 20 million contributed towards mental health charities. In February 2021, the Prime Minister appointed Dr. Alex George as Youth Mental Health Ambassador, an A&E doctor who had become passionate about a campaigner in this area due to his brother's own suicide. In April 2021, the most recent data showed that the number of people contacting the NHS seeking help for mental health problems reached a record high. The vocabulary of the pandemic has been much about the threats, as much about the threats to mental health as it has been about the threats to physical health. The new idiom is so familiar by now that we may hardly notice how openly and free of stigma most of us, and our leaders too, speak about the psychological and psychiatric impact of the pandemic. Think here too about the normalization of self-isolation, the loneliness of lockdowns, the deification of frontline health professionals, shielding ourselves with surgical masks, the medicalization of every aspect of our existence, and the early fears that the pandemic would lead to a spike in suicides. And for this new historical moment, there is a new psychiatric phenomenon. London-based psychotherapist Owen O'Kane has called it post-pandemic stress disorder. The establishment of the International COVID-19 Suicide Prevention Research Collaboration is a clear indication, too, of what was expected. As the Samaritans, the most active of suicide prevention charities, have noted, evidence from the National Confidential Inquiry and the University of Manchester suggests suicide rates during the first national lockdown in England had not been impacted in the way that many of us were concerned about. So based on early findings, and with the caveat that the full statistical picture has not yet been made available, a study published in The Lancet did not find a rise in suicide rates in England in the months after the first national lockdown began in 2020, despite evidence of greater distress. This is indeed fortunate, and it is a relief, of course, that suicide rates have belied expectations by not increasing, and in fact, decreasing slightly. The Economist, the magazine, has called it a welcome reprieve that suicide has become rarer in the pandemic. However, the overall trends are cold comfort to many who have nonetheless thoughts of taking their own lives, or those mourning people who have succeeded in suicide. With specific reference to nurses, and I'm of course echoing things that Sarah's already said, the Laura Hyde Foundation said that according to its own investigations, at least 226 nurses across all settings had attempted suicide in this period between the 1st of April 2020 and 30th of April 2021. Why? Well, a combination of the relentless confrontation with COVID deaths, emotional distress, exhaustion, and occupational burnout are understood to help explain this spike in suicide ideation and suicidal thoughts. So how do the history of nursing, suicide, and crisis converge and coalesce? There is a strong correlation between personal desperation, suicide, and national crisis. Across time and space, this correlation or this causation is something that has been diagnosed and constructed by clinicians and coroners, by academics and artists, by politicians and pundits, by the media, and by suicides themselves. Clearly, these issues and the ever-growing concern about suicidality and suicide at times of real and at times of media-magnified political crisis resonate with all of us. This pressing problem echoes across borders, across time periods, and across disciplines too. The issue is so pertinent at our moment in history because changes in suicide rates vary detectably with changes in the economy, such as downturns associated with higher rates, upturns with lower rates. And just for the most recent examples from contemporary history, it's undeniable but that the financial crisis, the migrant crisis, terrorism, Brexit have each alone and cumulatively taken their toll on the mental health of communities and individuals. Each of these emergencies, these examples of social disintegration, these aberrations from the phases of relative stability are linked to scarily mounting rates of suicide and in pandemic proportions. Since the later 19th century, the sociological approach to suicide has rested on the premise that the degree of integration in any given social unit is inverse to the number of suicides in that unit. The work of Caven in America, Halbach and Durkheim in France were chiefly influential in drawing attention to the supreme importance of social background. Emil Durkheim's taxonomy of suicide is the most well-known and its influence the most enduring. And he differentiates, of course, between egoistic suicide, altruistic suicide, anomic suicide, and fatalistic suicide. Nonetheless, the common denominator is that suicide is explained by the individual's relations to society and the individual's response to social, political, and moral crisis. To put it this way, society does not shed any light on suicide, but suicide does shed light on society. It has to be stated quite clearly, the sociology of suicide teaches us nothing about suicide insofar as it is an individual tragedy. And I'm, of course, echoing much of what Ian has said to us already in these 2 days. Suicides and the rhetoric of suicide serve as synecdoches for the interaction between private and collective crisis, individual mental health, and the condition of the body politic, and the psychological subject and society. In their recent book, Usurping Suicide, Suman Gupta has most helpfully clarified the dominant strands of suicide studies: suicidology and prevention of suicide, sociology and suicide rates, philosophical horizons, and academic and cultural reflectivity. Ian Marsh stresses that suicide must be regarded as a voluntary act, and this leads the way clear for understanding suicide as a political act, interpreting suicide in terms of resistance, refutation, or protest. The study of suicide as a multidisciplinary area of research over the last 150 years or so has clearly informed public debates and generally advocated compassionate understanding on ethical, legal, medical, theological, criminological, and legal grounds. However, this social or socially determined interpretation of suicide has hardly been constant. The pendulum swings, as we've already heard, between an individuated, patient-based mental illness model where suicide is an act of a unique individual, and each act is a suicide event. And in this general approach, external crisis is incidental, and suicide is largely divested of political meaning, versus those approaches that give due weight to external factors and as causality. In this latter sense, then, social dislocation, political persecution, the macro crises all have explanatory value. Clearly, discourses that explain suicide, especially suicide as an epidemic or as a contagion, are highly politicized and serve compelling and competing political narratives and agendas. This is especially the case in overtly political suicides, public suicides such as self-immolation, hunger striking, and suicide bombing. The political symbolism and messages these final acts of self-destruction carry with them can be readily apparent, or they can be more subtly sedated. Okay, there was, and this is what I would like to turn to now, there was an apparent suicide epidemic of suicides that were related and correlated with the international crisis and the coming of war in Britain in 1938 till about 1940. There are many ways in which the 1930s have been periodized and characterized. So we talk about the hungry 30s, the locust years, the age of appeasement, the morbid age, which is very evocative, and of course, from the outbreak of war, we talk about the People's War. What I'd like to suggest here as an equally valuable and vivid descriptor would be that this period should be understood as a war of nerves, thereby giving necessary recognition and notice to the tangible and material, the ethereal and emotional, and the psychological and visceral experience of those suspenseful and bewildering months from the Munich crisis in September 1938 to the so-called, or the end of the so-called phony war in the spring of 1940. And of course, that tallies very closely with historical events here in the Netherlands. As war veteran, man of letters, second rank Bloomsburyite, literary scholar, and crisis diarist, F.L. Lucas, or Peter Lucas as he was called, put it, the crisis seems to have filled the world with nervous breakdowns. Or perhaps the crisis itself was only one more nervous breakdown of a world driven by the killing pace of modern life and competition into ever acuter neurasthenia. So how did it feel to live through it all? How did it feel to want to die because of the oppressive war fear and due to spiraling levels of private, but also of public anxiety? What is clear is that private and individual experience mirrored the collective anxiety. As Virginia Woolf mused in mid-September 1938, odd this new public anxiety, how it compares with private, how it blinds. Her despondency deepening, the next day she confessed, "It's a hopeless war this, when we know winning means nothing. So we are committed for the rest of our lives to public misery. This will be slashed with private too." A couple of days later, Woolf diagnosed, just as in violent personal anxiety, the public lapses into complete indifference. One can feel no more at the moment, revealing the extent of emotional exhaustion, personal and general. It goes without saying, of course, that Woolf would be one. She doesn't quite fit into the crisis suicide category because of the timing, but she would take her life too. The crisis was a national one, to be sure, but it was also one with very private and personal ramifications. So this is the formula I'm trying to suggest, and that it can be explained or demonstrated most vividly in instances of mental breakdown, and more specifically in the striking number of cases that made up this apparent suicide epidemic. So one of the saddest patterns to detect is the rise in the rate, or at least the press coverage, of suicides. In Britain, in one after another report of coroner's proceedings, the war scare was identified as the cause of the suicide. Headlines ran like this: Poplar crisis suicide. 2 men found dead, feared war. Suicide due to crisis. And dozens more like that. A Spanish newspaper ran with this headline: Artificial alarmism provokes a spate of suicides in England, referring to the number of suicides which are committed daily by people terrorized at the thought of war. Now, it's instructive to see this diagnosis of a British suicide epidemic from a Spanish source. What could be more decisive resolution to the war of nerves than taking one's own life? A self-willed final exit and release from the intolerable fear and phobia of modern war. And of course, the persecution of political dissidents and Jews in Germany from 1933, the Anschluss, the Nazi seizure of the Sudetenland, and then the rest of Czechoslovakia, Kristallnacht, the Nazi seizure of the rump of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Each of these was a direct cause of suicide pandemics in these areas. And we just spoke yesterday to add the Netherlands to that. Of course, it's just slightly outside my time frame, but was it 243 Jewish suicides that you mentioned? In Amsterdam alone. All right, so this suicide pandemic was covered extensively in the British press, so I bring it back to Britain this way. It was covered either in the form of reporting on countless cases of distinguished individuals had been driven to suicide by their Nazi persecutors, or as stories of the massed hundreds and even thousands of Jews who took their lives trapped in desperation and in despair. In both forms, the biographical and the group, these reports left British readers in no doubt about the techniques and the very real consequences of Nazi terror. Arguably, readers would have identified with these tragic cases. We can only infer what impact these news items would have had on those who were themselves of a nervous disposition and susceptible to suicidal impulses. The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, was held to account in a number of inquests because it had been found that the victim had been troubled by listening to the crisis news on the wireless. That we're not just talking about random occurrences, but that this is some kind of observable pattern, a contagion, an epidemic, is evident at the local level. For instance, in Nelson, Lancashire, in the space of only 1 week, there were 4 gas suicides. At the inquest, some of the mysteries were unsolved. At one, the recent crisis was assigned as prying on one of the victims' minds. Possibly the times through which we're passing have played their part in these tragedies, for they're extraordinarily difficult and trying, the coroner decided. A spate of war-triggered suicides was substantial evidence of the dramatic domestic impact of the international crisis. To clarify, there was a statistical rise in suicides in 1938. That being said, I'm not principally relying here on the mathematical or statistical evidence. What interests me is a kind of genus of suicides that are qualitatively and anecdotally relevant and revealing. From the sources that are available for this study, so I've used mainly newspapers and where possible, I followed up with coroner's reports, but as I've discussed with Lindsay, these coroner's reports have mostly been destroyed and are not available. But what is clear from the reporting, both in the newspaper and in the coroner's proceedings, is that suicides are being treated with understanding and sympathy. Compassion and empathy from the pressure imposed by this international emergency and the menace of a gas and aerial war on civilians, which of course was what all feared, all of those things eclipsed, I think, moral, religious, and legal considerations and judgments. Suicide was, of course, still illegal. It wouldn't be until 1961 in Britain with the Suicide Act that it was decriminalized. In so many of these cases, we also see rigid constructions of war-willing masculinity disturbed, and equally inflexible expectations of feminine protectiveness, feminine protective instinct, and self-sacrifice challenged. Now, the unifying characteristics of these suicide cases was fear of the war to come and refusal to live through another war. Of the 176 cases that I have been able to identify so far, there are only a few that have a direct bearing on the themes of this conference, insofar as the occupation of the suicide was nursing. In one of these cases, it is clear that the suicide's occupation was nursing, and that is the case of Alfred Newman, male nurse, as he was identified, aged 56, from London, married, who was found in a room full of gas on a Sunday at the end of September 1938. His wife stated at the inquest that he dreaded the idea of another war. The verdict was suicide while of unsound mind. So only one case, and none where the where the nurse, none other where the profession was nursing. However, nurses are implicated and part of many of the other cases that I've covered in myriad ways. As those who find the victim and try to revive them, as those who treated the victim for medical and nervous disorders, as those who come to the aid of attempted suicides. In addition, several of these suicides take place in nursing homes, especially mental hospitals, and it is the case often that nurses provide testimony in the coroner's hearings. There are, in the cohort of 176, a number of other medical professionals, though, doctors, psychologists, dentists, and dental assistants. For example, a Bournemouth doctor killed himself because he had been depressed since the crisis, as it was described, and his mind had been unbalanced owing to the possibility of war. This is the language that is always used. So to just draw a couple of conclusions. We're right to spotlight the roles the role nurses play in caring and healing, in listening, and in crisis management in the field of mental health and in response to psychological crisis. While in my study of crisis suicide, these caring functions are obscured, even maybe erased, it's clear that nurses are at the front line of suicide prevention. In researching the history of the charitable suicide prevention organization, the Samaritans, founded in Britain in 1953 by Reverend Chad Vara, I come across a story of a woman who called herself Lavina. Lavina described her training to be a nurse in the 1950s, and that while she could accept death, when it was gentle and timely, she could not accept it when, as she put it, when it came as a result of a deliberate act of self-destruction, and this, as she put it, shattered her. She found a purpose in volunteering for the Samaritans, an organization pledged to help those tempted to suicide and despair. The Samaritans grew and spread across the UK and became affiliated with the International Association for the Prevention of Suicide, and participated in the formation of the International Federation of Telephone Services in Europe. It only seems right, I think, to end with Lavina's story and with the Samaritans. Who knows how many of the 176 cases that I have found who are crisis suicides could have been helped, how these suicides could have been prevented had this service existed 15 years previously. So thank you.
Thanks so much. So if the three presenters would like to come to the front, and we have some time for questions and comments. Thank you, Julie, for such a fascinating paper, and it's so interesting to have that historical context as a way of sort of situating present-day crises, as you so interestingly described, linked to COVID, linked in the UK context to Brexit. So I really found it a fascinating paper. I'm going to just start, I'm going to abuse my privilege. I have the mic, I have the power, by asking a first question. Alison and Peter, I really liked your presentation, and I just wanted to pick up on one point, Alison, that you mentioned, and you talked about the sort of risks of nurses becoming desensitized to suicidal patients, and how that is, you know, negative, becoming too emotionally detached from patients who are experiencing intense suffering and trauma. And I was just wondering, from your experience, how nurses negotiate, I suppose, the two extremes of being emotionally desensitized, distinguishing that from becoming too emotionally involved and invested in the patient, and the experience of trying to negotiate a professional path between those two emotional experiences, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it is really difficult, and I think it is that, you know, you have to have a professional boundary, and it's very difficult when you're a nurse, and particularly I'm talking particularly about nurses working on wards, because any nurse here that's worked a 3 a.m. shift on a Sunday morning where the ward is terrible, people are trying to leave, but they're shouting, people are trying to harm themselves, that feeling of, you know, overwhelming, and it's about having to maintain that relationship with your patients and be present with your people as well, and your patients as well. That's one end of it. And then you go to the other side, which is nurses working in crisis care, where every single day they're working with patients who are acutely suicidal, not people that are saying, I may kill myself, people saying, I am going to kill myself. And it's about making sure you, again, it's all about, you know, you reflect as a team, you reflect and say, okay, I made this decision, was it the right decision or was it the wrong decision? Let's have a think about it. And then continue training. And you have to, it's almost like reset the scales, and you have to do it frequently. So where I work at the minute, we've just reviewed our clinical risk training, that all clinical staff have to do it. It's 3 days clinical risk training, so it's very intense. And we ask our staff to do working in the crisis care every year. Every year they have to go to the 3 days again, because we have to be reminded. I have to be reminded. When I was working in liaison psychiatry, I have to be reminded, because we talk about red flags for suicide, and those red flags lose their colour a bit. Don't become quite so, not waving quite so high at times. So we just have to spend the time and think. And I said one of the things that we have, which is our freedom in psychiatry, is we can sit and think. And that's such a bonus to us all.
Gosh, that's so interesting, fascinating. Thank you, Alison. Peter, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add to that, there's a training piece for younger or people changing career, whatever it might be, around reflective practice and systemic thinking. This particular conference was interesting because there's historians, philosophers, people from different backgrounds, ages, cultures. If you get it into the culture that we ought to reflect, and I like the quote from the paper, it's published so it can be read. The nurse isn't straightforward and scientific in her comments, but she was present for me when I read it. You could be that person, and yes, I feel desensitized. I'm aware that that's a person that died. I'm less desensitized as a result of that. But going back to your point about the boundaries, I am a professional, so this is part of my work, but that's different to saying, oh, it's just part of the job. Sure, people die all the time in hospitals and so on. So it's the reflective piece, but it's the systemic piece, I think, is missing from a lot of education. The bit where you say, hey, hang on a second, what do I really think about this based on where I'm coming from, personally and professionally. And then if you've got support from colleagues, you've got a good, positive culture in place, you can discuss that with someone that you think might actually know more about this than you do, or say to you, you're probably overthinking that piece, or you need to think some more about that. I think a lot of it is reacting to, and it's because everyone's so busy. Plus, if there's a crisis over here, and you're working particularly in inpatient settings, but also in outpatient clinics, you can rest assured there's a fair chance there'll be a crisis over there. There'll be a crisis after lunch. There might be some dynamics between staff. People are tired. There's a pandemic. People generally in all jobs are a bit burnt out, etc., etc. If you can reflect on things, then you can go, hey, that's happening. I need to step back. I need to go for a walk, or whatever it is you need to do to get yourself a little bit better. So that's an important skill for all of us to have and to remind ourselves of.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those responses. Has anybody in the audience got a question? Manon? Oh yeah, of course, sorry. I forgot that bit.
Thank you. I have a question for Julie. On one of your slides, you had the phrase rational suicides, and I wondered if that was your term, but was it for a concept at the time that in the 1930s suicide was a rational, logical choice? And when you're reflecting on this post-Brexit depressive syndrome, whether there was any kind of reflection, because it was considered quite rational to be depressed about the Brexit decision, was there then a framework of seeing suicide as rational and logic within that discourse or not?
Yes, I think going back to going back to the 1930s, definitely, in many of the suicide cases that I've investigated, it is clear if you start to do a kind of forensic analysis and this kind of, this what I would call a political autopsy of suicide. You do find that the case that it is a very rational. Whether the term was used exactly that way, I'll have to go through my material again. I'm not so sure, but the evidence is very clear. When you look at one particular case, I think I'll go with the anecdotal. One of the crisis suicides that I look at in some detail is that of Helena Swanwick, who was a suffragist, a pacifist, an absolute pacifist by the late 1930s. Many pacifists changed their minds when they were confronted by the reality of Nazism, but she still held strong. And she was already very ill and elderly in her mid 70s. But she took the decision to take her own life. It was not, and she made it very clear in all the material that she wrote. She had written a memoir that was published in 1935, where she discussed her philosophical views on euthanasia, etc. And then, so when she took her own life, and the note that she left was as rational as it could be. It was very clear that this was a complete choice. This had nothing to do with mental illness. This shouldn't be read that she was of unsound mind. She was a completely sound mind. That term of unsound mind, those who were planning and kind of had an MO about their own suicide wanted to make it clear that this was not being of unsound mind. And there were many others in that category who cited, the world crisis and the political circumstances that made their suicide the only logical, the only rational choice. Is that?
Yeah. And post-Brexit, did you see it?
I haven't looked at, I don't know if I haven't, done that work. But with Brexit, it's not quite clear. Again, it's how, a suicide is recorded and studied in the last, 5, 6, 7 years. It's different than the way it was recorded. Again, there isn't as much coverage as we've kind of discussed earlier. There's, there are more constraints on the press in covering suicides, and we don't find, I don't know anyone who's actually studied this kind of group or this genus of suicides as the Brexit suicides. But there has been an investigative report in the New Statesman about exactly this, which included some of my research. We're trying to understand how Brexit has triggered, deep distress and suicidal thoughts, and maybe even suicides in response. But I think we need the time to reflect and the distance to categorize and to make sure that we're qualifying and categorizing these suicides correctly in that way.
I've seen 2 hands. I'll try to take people in order. Chris, first of all.
Thanks very much to everybody. I just wondered if we might need different terms, because it seems to me the kind of suicides that Julie is describing and suicides that can be described accurately as entirely rational might be qualitatively too different to the kinds of behaviours we see in secure mental health units or people who are in distress that is inexplicable to others. Right? There's plenty of distress going on when someone is fleeing the Nazis, but they also make a rational decision to end their lives, like Walter Benjamin, right, who ends his life whilst fleeing the Nazis in northern Spain, I think. So there's clearly
there's a number, just as a, you know, again, some evidence. There's a number of Jews who don't take their lives until they actually reach safety, which is, you know, paradoxical in and of itself. But Harry, I just want
but I think that whilst there is distress there, it is a fundamentally different kind of distress to the material that we, not material, to the human beings we see in mental health units, and I just wonder, might we need to be really careful and to create a real distinction between the kinds of distress that attend the endings of lives, because I do think that to me they seem to be fundamentally distinct.
I just want to say, I think it's what our perception of distress is. So to somebody that's the war is going to be happening in a couple of weeks, it's clear to understand, isn't it? It's not always as clear to understand what an individual's distress is, because we don't know. Again, like I said, you know, people are opaque, we don't know. It's like somebody, so again, working in liaison psychiatry in general hospitals, why one person with a diagnosis of motor neuron disease doesn't end their life, when another person does, we don't know. And it's so difficult to interpret. And I think when we're going back to nursing again, when we talk about nursing, there's always a discussion, is nursing an art or a science? And there's very much, it's the two, and you do the science side of nursing, we tick the boxes, we do the tools and the psychological testing, and then it's that art of nursing where we interpret what we have and putting everything together. And I'm not saying only nurses do it, but psychiatric nurses are very good at doing it. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to consider all those aspects, because everybody's an individual, and that's how we have to look at it at the end of the day.
Thank you. Can I just, yeah, that's very important, and it would be good to, you know, historians have access to those notes in due course as well, to see where, you know, social or political stressors fit, you know, are part of the picture. But that goes back to the sources. I mean, how do I define, or how am I able to define these so-called crisis suicides? And it comes down to the fact that it's in the coroner's hearings, it's in the testimonies, in the testimony of the family most often, where the causation is identified as the crisis or the fear of war or the you know, the very, very real social pressures. Amongst my sample, I only have a handful of people who are clearly Jewish or refugees. Most of these are Britons, you know, across age range and class range and regional, etc. But I mean, these are people who are experiencing the crisis very much vicariously, and that's important. And that's why I made that point about our relationship, you know, for most of us in Western Europe, to the horrors in the Ukraine. Some people are deeply, deeply moved and distressed, but it is still something quite external to us. And that was what most of these 170 plus cases, that's how they were experiencing the crisis, is something imagined, as something, you know, almost you know, as a kind of dystopian dream in front of them, rather than, you know, having personal experience of a terror. And as I say, we know this because of how these suicides are narrated by others. Rather than by the suicides themselves. Very few of them have suicide notes, and you know, that we know of. The ones that we do sometimes disappointingly don't tell us what we want them to tell. It is those around them who are narrating their suicides, who are validating their suicides as important as indicators of what's going on in the world at large, because of the crisis.
Just a small point on that. Most of us will have our own issues in life. And then if there's an invasion somewhere, some of our own issues get mapped onto the map of the invasion. So there is that. And then there's sensitive artistic people that make protest songs, but they may have their own psychological issues, and they get transferred on. So yes, distinctions are important, because you're trying to serve people as best you can. So you're trying to get the best narrative you can. But I wouldn't say they're entirely separate.
Excellent. Okay, we have a few more questions. I think. Did you have a question?
I'd like to give other people a chance first.
Are you sure? Okay, so you had a question.
I'm Peter Bas-Lalleman from Founders University. I'm so surprised about the fact that we are coming from a very depoliticized nursing area, actually. I think in the Netherlands, I'm not sure about the NHS or England, but I'm so pleasantly surprised about the fact that politics, and not being a politician, but just the politics of nursing and the way it works and it's embedded in a society is represented here today, which I really appreciate. If I look at all the stories, so not the technical part, but the combination of the both. So I want to compliment everyone there. And actually, did I hear Walter Benjamin over there in the corner? Which I think it's a wonderful example. Maybe it wraps it all up, because what I like. What he says is, in one of his books, I think it's Arcades, I have nothing to tell, only to show. And if I go to my Belgian colleagues, I think everyone here, they really showed what nursing and caring in this terrible crisis is about. So for me, a wonderful way, all the different eclectic ways of looking and perspectives come together here. So I want to thank everyone for this beautiful morning. No real question, but only the fact that that's here. It's a compliment.
Such a lovely comment. Thank you. We had another question here. Oh, sorry, who was...
A follow-up question on your earlier remark, where you've seen a big rise in suicides during that whole period leading up to the war, ending with the phony wall. And you told us about how sort of hallucinogenic effect of world news may have led, in some cases, to that suicide. The interesting thing I thought was that there's a natural experiment there, because following the phony war was an actual invasion, the Battle of Britain, the London Blitz. Did you see a reducing demand for psychiatric care? Did you see suicide reduction in that period?
Yeah, we don't need to give you a very long answer to that question. It's a brilliant question, a very important one, of course, and it allows us to identify whether there was a spike. There is a decrease in suicide rates during the war. There are a number of reasons for that. One is that one obvious one is suicides can be masked by all kinds of things, by military operations, by death in the Blitz, by putting yourself in risky positions, etc. But another piece of evidence I like to bring to bear is that there's an organization called Mass Observation in Britain, which is a sociological survey organization. First, it's a voluntary, and then it becomes more co-opted by the state, especially during the war and during the Blitz. And it does a study of attitudes towards death around 1943, and there is so little discussion in those replies of suicide itself. Most people don't mention suicide or suicidality in any way. And the reason is, many of the reasons that they want to continue living, even in these very precarious times when life is so incredibly risky, is they want to see what happens in the end. They want to see the end of the story in a way. And their attitudes towards death become, much more, that life is itself a risk. Why would you take your own life? So that might kind of help explain some things. But in terms of statistics, the statistics go down. That's just one illustrative reason why that might be the case. But it's a great question. Thank you.
I wonder, Julie, because I think that's really interesting that during World Wars, suicide rates go down, and surprisingly, during COVID-19, we didn't see an increase in suicides. And I wonder, is it the same external collective threat that social bonds and social relationships are strengthened when there is a belief there's an external collective threat?
That kind of common cause, and the keep calm, carry on ethos, where everyone kind of has a sense of purpose, and the sense of purpose, in the pandemic was keep calm, carry on, stay on your sofa, right? And that can be very harmful isolation to those who suffer, but it can also be a way of feeling that you're part of a collective effort without doing anything.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Another question here.
Yeah, first, it's more like a compliment first for Alice and Peter, because I had written down a question about how to, what do you need, but you already answered in your reflection. So, but anyway, it was crystal clear. Thank you for your touching presentation. But I did have a question for Julie. In what way can we view suicide that you described as empowering, thus taking the rights in your own hands?
So in sort of to make it chime with the pro-choice discussion and the pro-choice terminology that Ian's used, yes, I mean, I think that's a matter of interpretation. And in all cases, the suicide is, you know, a question of choice and free will. So yes, in all those cases. But I mean, again, I can't make a blanket statement about all of these because they all come, you know, some of the cases, you know, they have a history of mental health problems and mental illness, and so, you know, some were shell shock victims, some were, you know, suffering from neurasthenia, some have a long history of nervous disorder and nervous disease. So, you know, they are. Is it free will? No, they, you know, again, we need to look at, you know, there are some which are very kind of, you know, clearly, you know, their mental, you know, what triggered their suicide was related quite directly to you know, to the moment in time and to that crisis moment. And for many others, it was possibly inevitable given their long history of mental illness. So I think you can't offer one answer, whether it's in all cases just a clear case of rational free will.
I'll talk about the weather for a minute. We've seen a big, there was some talk about suicide, and there was some discussion around not having it in the press because we didn't want to add to people's misery. But what we've seen is a wave of referrals recently. So when I talk about the weather, it's a little bit like there might be a lull. And what we saw in community setting was there was a whopping rise in referrals. Now that could also be because the GPs would be the primary source. People are coming into them because they can. They're stressed out. Let's do a referral into the psychiatric services. Now we're the secondary service, we're not primary care. So we have seen a rise, and that's putting further pressure on staff as well, because people are quite stretched at the minute, and they're stretched post-COVID, and people are still getting COVID and off work, etc., etc. So in terms of the historical things as well, there can be a wave, and then it's only anecdotal on my part. I've worked with a couple of people, and my favorite example is somebody who was in his 70s, long-term depression, all the usual stories, but he was jumping across a gap in a bog in a field, and his leg went down into a trench and his bone came out. I never saw him so well. I really didn't. So sometimes when there's something big and dramatic, like when somebody actually slaps your face or something like that, that can prompt a period of mental health wellness. So it's always good to think outside the box, I think.
So interesting. Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions?
Because I thought you were talking about real suicided nurses, didn't you?
Yeah.
360.
Yeah.
And you had
Yeah, the
266
statistics I found were
attempts.
just about
Attempts, yeah.
So, I mean,
But that's a lot of
I need your
people. So 566 by, no, even more, yeah.
I think though for nurses as well, I think what you have to do is you have to get up every day and go into work. And I think it's very difficult for nurses to say, actually, I need help. I really do need help. And there's, you know, amongst ourselves as a group, we can be critical of our colleagues who are like, because what you do is if you don't go into work that day, you let your colleagues down.
Yeah.
And people feel that real important of being together, working as a team together, and you can't let other people down because you know how difficult it is.
But have you got any ideas since when? Since when is England counting this? Because in Holland this is not counted. The professions are not counted. So
they've only did it for the first time in 2017. They
Okay.
It was done historically, but the Office for National Statistics
Okay.
has only did this national survey of
Okay.
suicides by occupation very recently. Before then, there
Oh.
hasn't been recent statistics.
A recent start.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
My question was to Julie and Peter. Do you think it's the responsibility of an employer to give the nurses some kind of support when they went through some traumatic situations or viewing suicide attempts or something like that? And do you, of course, it's also a reflection to yourself and with your team and how the situation happened, and of course immediately after it happened. But my experience is that what you were saying is it's better to go to work again, and it's difficult to explain with yourself, is this a problem for me or not? And do you think that's it's an employer's responsibility to give some post-traumatic EMDR or something like that?
I think it's 100% the employer's responsibility to look after their staff, 100%. Talking to Sarah earlier, really interesting about the responsibility of an employer in France, and then the sort of no legal responsibility of an employer in the UK, but there's a moral responsibility of an employer in the UK, and I think it's 100% the responsibility to offer that staff member whatever it is they need, and particularly post-pandemic, because we know that we had a fairly small support service for staff. We now have a huge support service for staff, where staff have a 24-hour call line if they need to. They can get 6 sessions of talking therapy if they need it, plus they can get everything else they need. And it's so important, because not only would it help save people's lives, reduce suicides, but it keeps colleagues as well. It makes you feel that what you do is being valued as well. So my answer is 100% that it's the work responsibility to look after their staff.
Yeah, just one more thing on that in terms of mutual expectations. It's important for the culture that the employee approaches the employer as well, just to get that into the culture. We have made a protocol on this, and we say it's your responsibility to talk to your manager if you wish, but we have a way around that if there's a problem with your relationship. It's a signal to go get some help. And again, going back to what Alison was saying, particularly in the context of nursing, there's this almost like sacrificial lamb type thing, where nurses give so much of themselves that they might totally collapse and be off work for 3 months after. So.
In terms of how historians in the future might be able to prove or disprove that there is a spike in suicide due to the political crisis, we need to have that evidence in autopsy reports, in psychological autopsy reports, in coroner's hearings. And by what I hear, and because of the individuated approach to mental healthcare and to interpreting suicides, we're not going to have those sources. So I wonder, it's a question of are we asking, I know it's not a question that is of primary, kind of importance to clinicians, but if it's not asked, we'll never know. And I think that, and it's just inferring, there is a spike in suicides, which coincides with times of acute crisis. That's not going to be enough to make the case. And I think whether one could ask clinicians to think, whether, this patient was affected in any way by things that you normally wouldn't worry about, or as clinicians, whether we could fit that in, or whether we could actually affect, at least put it on your questionnaire as such.
So one thing that we do when we have a death of a patient, any death of a patient, particularly a death by suicide, we have to complete a thing called a 72-hour report. So within 72 hours of us finding out about the death, we have a team of people together. It's a multidisciplinary team to look through the potential causes. We don't usually have the cause of death at that point because of the time, but we have a new little box on it to say, was the death as a direct or indirect due to COVID? Because we know that a lot of our patients who have been really, really lonely and haven't seen any of the people that they've seen, and we don't always know at that point, 3 days after, but we consider it at that point to say, could this be directly or indirectly due to COVID?
Okay, so thank you once again to our three presenters for two really brilliant presentations that have ended the conference. We're now going to move on to Cecile and Manon, who are going to make some concluding remarks. So thank you very much again.
Well, I would like to thank everybody, and I leave the concluding remark to Manon, because I was so soaked in the organization that sometimes it was hard for me to listen, because I was thinking, who's coming next, what I have to do. So I have Manon has taken the concluding remarks. I'm glad that you will do that. But I would like to ask everyone, because I received many presentations, but there are also spoken words that I did not receive. And if every noise is not, suppose it's not really good on the live stream, I would like to receive the text, because maybe we will use it for making some kind of publication about this conference. So I would like to receive the text of Ian and Julie and all people who have spoken. Also you, if you want to write it down for a short text, I would be very pleased with that. So thank you.
Yes, thanks. I think it's a rather impossible task, actually, to sum up and draw together some threads over such a rich and diverse range of presentations. And there is a plan to have a kind of summary article in a special issue of the journal from the European Association for the History of Nursing. So that is where I'll put more thoughtful, sensible, well thought out conclusions. And these are just really initial thoughts that I've been thinking about and taking note of as we've gone along. So I apologize that they're a bit rough. But thinking about trying to link the past and the present as a historian of medicine to try and draw those connections here, I'm really struck by continuities and contradictions that have come up over and over again. Particularly in terms of continuities, the idea that stigma endures, and that is true in secular Netherlands and not just Catholic Ireland, even after the transitions from religious and legal condemnation. And we've heard a lot as well about a broader landscape of moral, economic, and practical arguments against suicide. So it brings me to reflect on the preventative work of social censure. How does that fit with the current imperative to destigmatize suicide? Does that undermine the possible protective value of moral or other condemnation? And when we aim to destigmatize, do we really mean destigmatize suicidal thoughts, but not the act itself, if we're still so committed to prevention? And Wouter Kusters and Ian Marsh have asked us to think about going beyond destigmatization to recognize the autonomy of an individual who wants to die. And as Wouter said, exercising a freedom to choose whether to live or die. But that choice is made within an influential matrix of structural issues such as poverty and discrimination. So again, autonomy and a structure, another contradiction. But the often repeated notion that suicide is a societal failure and that we're all implicated doesn't actually get us any closer to addressing the issues and the policies that drive people to complete the act. And instead, it just seems possibly to spread the sense of shame and burden among a broader group of people. As Lindsay showed us yesterday, the austerity politics of today are just the latest version of much older Malthusian logic of productivity as an indicator of human worth. And it's a point also underlined by Georgina Laragy's reference to the disability rights movement, who have powerfully critiqued our contemporary emphasis on productivity and independence as characteristics of ableist societies, showing that it's those values that contribute to disability stigma. It's also interesting to note that the stigma of disability is so pronounced that even people identifying positively with their own mental health issues in a form of mad pride often resist associating mental illness with disability, while others describe mental health issues as disabling. And let's not forget, when it comes to disabled people, suicide, euthanasia, and even murder in the form of mercy killings are socially accepted because of ableist assumptions about the quality of life of someone with a disability or severe and chronic illness. So that's really just a call to think about how disability history might be woven into some of the stories that we've been hearing over the conference. In the historical shift away from religious and legal prohibitions against suicide towards medico-scientific framings, it's striking that although people with suicidal thoughts seem to have become increasingly open and vocal, as Katerina Backer's work on novels and autobiographies showed, others around them have remained silent. We just heard about the press, but also healthcare professionals. And the idea that discussing suicide might encourage someone to try to die is still widespread and has come up frequently, although apparently research discredits this assumption. But as Wouter mentioned yesterday, apparently researching suicide on the internet can increase the risk. And Ian referred to pro-suicide forums that can play a role in assisting people to complete suicide or in promoting alternatives. So that gives us another contradiction. Talking about it is good, but only with the right people in the right circumstances. But who decides what's right, and how can we even control these elements in the internet age? Moreover, Hannah Zevins' History of Crisis Helplines emphasized their role for people who are marginalized by society and not helped and even harmed by medical or state intervention, particularly queer people and those experiencing domestic violence or sexual abuse. Now that history should give us pause to think about how reliant we are today on healthcare staff and systems, many of whom have ambiguous feelings about whether they should even be involved, as the surveys that Cecile discussed yesterday have shown us, and which also has a long history. As the integrated, relational, holistic approach that we heard about this morning is being promoted, there's clearly a broadening out from medical staff to include family members, for example. But that's also revealed contradictions between what family members want and need and the suicidal person themselves and this new approach among health professionals. And the example given this morning was relatives wanting restraints or being skeptical of freedom and supporting surveillance and room checks. Now, maybe some of this requirement or call from family members comes from the anxiety, burden, and sense of responsibility, all of those implicated in the care of someone with suicidal ideation experience. So the model of acceptance that Ian mentioned earlier today sits alongside a repeated assertion in this workshop that you cannot prevent every death. In that way, we've acknowledged that reality, but it appears we haven't accepted it. And Chris raised the question earlier about power and safety and the moment when danger or risk means that this new approach or the listening has to stop. So this move from empowerment to focus on saving someone. And that seems to be the moment or the rationale for breaking agreements, breaking patient confidentiality, and shifting from connection to control, in the words of the presentation earlier. Actions which Yuri van der Vol's research suggests increases negative thoughts and further undermines healing. The burden on family members, the negative impact on nursing staff that comes from constant vigilance and this sense of responsibility is also unhealthy. So that raises questions too then about the wider harm potentially caused by the therapeutic approach. Thinking about it in this way underscores how a relational, mutual model, as Ian's description of peer support communities framed it, would acknowledge caring going in different directions then, not just from the caregiver to the suicidal person. And that's something that I think was really strongly underlined by the previous session on caring for the caregivers, to think about how everybody is involved then, and this trend, what is the risk of the trend to ask nurses for more emotional engagement? So it ties together how we're all implicated in the causes and the consequences of suicide. And Peter Murphy called for interdisciplinarity earlier, and I think history and the humanities have a place, but are often left out in those calls and the list of disciplines, especially when we see suicide not as an individual pathology, but part of a wider web of social and cultural issues. So unsurprisingly, as the medical historian, I'm going to end with a plea to engage more with the history, but also more meaningfully with that history, because I think there's a strong tendency to draw a sharp distinction between an ignorant, coercive past and an enlightened scientific present. And we see this especially in museums that are very resistant to dealing with difficult histories, where objects of restraint are becoming hard to display because there's an idea that it's too confronting for the general public. So real shying away from that story of the past. And also a kind of a shallow presentation of it, and not understanding how there's continuities between why those strategies were used in the past, just as there's complicated reasons for why they have continued to be used today. So we need to better understand that complicated landscape of the past and its ongoing legacies, not just in people's fears of medical intervention or institutionalization as having like a fearful image of this horrible past, but acknowledging that its actual present experiences that also play into why people resist medical intervention and institutionalization. And how difficult it is to acknowledge within the medical profession that many elements, systemic elements, endure from that past, instead of assuming, as we often do, that medicalization was problematically used in the past, but it is the right response and it's constantly being improved. So I think we have to move away from that kind of simplistic narrative. And as Sarah pointed out yesterday, we need to go further than documents and accounts of physicians to examine the material culture. And I really think part of the value of that is that they're so much more open-ended and so difficult to interpret that they actually really open up ways of understanding the relationships between patients and practitioners, precisely because their meanings shift as they're used and adapted. They're very unstable sources. But as we've heard, so are our statistics, so are all of our other documents, and we can learn a lot from how historians can show ways to open up methodologically how to interpret that source material to better understand the stories contained within them. And I also think history is a very valuable tool of reflection, precisely because it's so far removed sometimes from the present moment that it might be easier to reflect on what happened at that moment and what the impact was, and you have a less of an association with personal accountability and responsibility. And yet, even though it's far away, there are clearly, as our papers have shown, there's great resonances between the past and the issues today. And so I believe that history is useful now, but only if we're willing to see it in all of its complexity and acknowledge some of the continuities that have been made really clear in our presentations throughout. Thank you. Do you want to do a final goodbye? Or I should thank everybody, all of our participants, but
We are having a lunch, yeah?
yes, we will have lunch together
We are having lunch in the garden. We are
in the
outside
garden.
for the garden, because the room is now for another occasion.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you again to Cecile for doing the bulk of the work for this big event.